It was clearly just a dead, blackened, rotten bamboo stalk, but your eyes lit up as if you'd seen a priceless treasure. You even raised a rusty machete and started chopping frantically. The passing villagers all laughed, saying you were delirious with hunger. But what they didn't know was that in your newly awakened, special vision, the joints of this rotten bamboo stalk were emitting a dazzling, milky white halo. Though in everyone else's eyes it was worthless, only you knew that inside this bamboo stalk, densely packed, were plump bamboo worms more valuable than gold. All it would take was one good chop. Not only could you save your critically ill, bedridden mother, but in the 1980s, an era of golden opportunity, you could earn your first pot of gold since being reborn. Joe Chenglin struggled to open his eyes. His vision filled with a blackened, thatched roof. The northwest wind gusted into the room, making the windows howl like a wailing ghost. From the next room came a fit of heart-wrenching coughs. It was the voice of his mother, Wang Gafang. Every cough felt like a knife twisting in his heart. Memories flooded his mind like a bursting dam. He had been reborn. He was back in 1983, the year that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This was the year the Zhou family's world came crashing down. His father had broken his leg and passed away. The family's savings were completely wiped out. They were also saddled with a mountain of debt. Overwhelmed with anxiety, his mother had fallen gravely ill and was bedridden. The rice jar was cleaner than his own face. Last night, the last of the sweet potato peel soup had gone into Joe Chenglin's stomach. His mother's weak voice called out. She told him if he was hungry, he should drain the leftover medicinal herbs and eat them. He wasn't hungry. Joe Chenglin's nose stung with the urge to cry, and he clenched his jaw, saying nothing. He was afraid he'd start sobbing the moment he spoke. He pushed himself up with both hands on the ice-cold earthen bed, desperately trying to sit up, but his body felt as weak as a noodle. He was seeing stars. He couldn't just lie there. Lying there was the same as waiting to die. Joe Chenglin took a deep breath and swung himself out of bed. His feet landed on the ice-cold dirt floor. He steadied himself against the wall as he made his way to the main room, grabbing the dull, rusty machete from the corner. Pulling his tattered, cotton-padded jacket tight around himself, he pushed the door open and plunged into the biting autumn wind. He avoided the other villagers, taking a winding path that led deep into the bamboo forest on the back mountain. This place was a treasure trove for Greenstone Village, but it had also been the source of heartbreak for many. Everyone for miles around knew about the treasure hidden in this forest, thumb-sized bamboo worms. They were snow-white, packed with protein and fat. In an era where people rarely ate meat, these were a top-tier delicacy. When roasted, they sizzled and oozed with fat, so fragrant it was to die for. But the critters were incredibly hard to find. The only way was through sheer brute force. You could wear yourself out, chopping down dozens of bamboo stalks, only to find them all empty. And though everyone craved them, no one had the time or energy to gamble their work points on a long shot. Joe Chenglin stood amidst the piles of dead leaves and gave a bitter smile. Right now, he had nothing left to lose. He gritted his teeth and picked out a yellowed bamboo stalk. He raised the machete and swung with all his might. The shock of the impact made the web of his thumb go numb. After a dozen or so chops, it finally fell. He scrambled to split open the joints. Empty. There wasn't even a single dropping. Despair washed over him like a tidal wave. A sharp cramp seized his stomach, and a cold sweat instantly soaked his back. Just as his consciousness was about to fade to black, a sound suddenly exploded deep within his mind. A ringing, like a high-frequency current, shot through his entire body. It was followed by a cool stream of energy that rushed to his eyes. Joe Chenglin's eyes snapped open. The world had changed. The once dim bamboo forest became clearly layered, but what shocked him the most was that in the sea of gray-green bamboo, there were a very small number of stalks that were emitting a soft, milky white halo from their segments. The halo flickered on and off, like fireflies in the night, so bright it was almost piercing. Joe Chenglin's heart pounded wildly. A sudden surge of strength flowed through his exhausted body. He stared intently at the nearest glowing spot. It was an unremarkable old bamboo stalk. Inside its fourth segment, about 1.5 meters off the ground, the dense white light was actually squirming. After making sure no one was around, he crouched down and crept over. The bark of this old bamboo was black. From experience, there should be absolutely no worms inside. But to his eyes, the light inside was dancing merrily. His hatchet sliced open the bamboo stalk, the fibrous opening like a Pandora's box. As he pried it open, a large, white, plump, and chubby mass of something rolled out. They fell onto the dead leaves, wriggling. Bamboo worms. They were all bamboo worms. Each one was as thick as a thumb, milky white, and so fat they were practically glistening. This single section of bamboo was crammed with 40 or 50 of them. The sound of Joe Chenglin gulping was as loud as thunder. He could really see them. These weren't just worms. This was a pile of moving fat, a life-saving elixir. Extreme hunger made him throw all caution to the wind. He grabbed the fattest one, brushed off its hard head, and shoved it directly into his mouth. The moment he bit through the skin, a faint sweetness and a rich, creamy flavor exploded on his tongue. Even though it was raw, the satisfaction from the high protein content instantly soothed the cramps in his stomach. With bloodshot eyes, he devoured 4 or 5 more, and warmth finally returned to his body. As the burning fire in his stomach subsided, his senses returned. Zhou Chenglin looked at the remaining bamboo worms on the ground, and the greedy glint in his eyes turned to a cunning one. He couldn't just eat them all. He wasn't eating worms, he was eating money. Back home, there was no rice and no medicine. Just eating worms wouldn't do a damn thing. In the city's state-run canteens, these things were a top-tier delicacy. They were only rare because they were hard to find. Now that he had this special vision, it was like picking up money off the ground. Zhou Chenglin moved swiftly, picking up every last worm from the ground. He then camouflaged the spot and took off his back basket. First, he went to a shady spot and dug up a large patch of moss, soil and all. He laid it at the bottom of the basket to keep them fresh, then gently placed the delicate bamboo worms on top. He stood up and activated his vision again. To his left, about 10 odd meters away, and to his right, 30 meters away, milky white spots of light twinkled like stars. A smile curled at the corner of Zhou Chenglin's lips. At this moment, he no longer looked like a man fighting for survival. Instead, he looked like someone picking melons in his own garden. Now that he had his first taste of success, Zhou Chenglin was completely energized. He even learned to be picky. He ignored the ones with small halos, choosing only those that were dazzlingly bright. He stopped in front of a crooked, sickly-looking bamboo stalk. Its bark was blackened, and covered in spots, looking like a worthless stalk that had been dead for years. No one would take it even for free, but in his eyes, in the third segment of this worthless stalk, the clump of white light was as bright as a 100-watt light bulb. Confirming no one was around, Zhou Chenglin raised his hatchet and swung. He chopped the bamboo down with a few quick strikes and dragged it to a hidden ditch. He carefully split open the segment, and a bamboo fragrance mixed with a milky scent washed over him. It was densely packed with wriggling, white bamboo worms, squirming flesh against flesh. There were at least 60 or 70 of them, and every single one was fatter than the last batch he found. Zhou Chenglin grinned from ear to ear. If this were the modern world, a restaurant would sell this for 100, maybe 80 yuan. But right now, this was hard currency for rice and white flour. For the next half hour, he became a relentless chopping machine. Spotting the right bamboo, chopping it down, dragging it away, and collecting the prize. His movements were fluid and smooth. Before long, a thick layer covered the bottom of his back basket. A sea of writhing white, both unsettling and delightful. He hefted it, feeling the weight. At least 5 or 6 pounds. At the price of wild game, this could be traded for several pounds of fatty pork. Just as he was getting into the swing of it, the sound of cursing and complaining suddenly came from the mountain path in the distance. Someone said, "What a damn waste of time. Worked my ass off all morning for nothing. I don't know which son of a bitch. Said there were lots of worms over here. My hands are all blistered from chopping. And I haven't even sniffed a single damn worm." Zhou Chenglin's heart skipped a beat. His movements stopped abruptly. It was Zhao Erleng from the east end of the village. That guy was a lazy good-for-nothing. He must have been out here trying his luck. It was too late to run. That would just draw attention. And there was nowhere to hide in this sparse grove. Zhou Chenglin took a deep breath and quickly grabbed a large handful of dry bamboo leaves. He covered the freshly harvested worms and plopped down on a rotten log. He pulled the back basket behind him to hide it, then picked up his chopping knife. He started hacking away randomly at an empty bamboo stalk in front of him. Thump, thump, thump. Zhao Erleng appeared, carrying a net with only a few sparse. A dozen or so pathetic-looking worms, all trying to crawl out. Seeing Zhou Chenglin, he paused for a moment, then a sneer spread across his face. "Well, if it isn't Chenglin, not at home taking care of that sickly old mother of yours? You're out here trying to get rich, huh?" The words were harsh, but Zhou Chenglin didn't react. He dropped his chopping knife on the ground and forced a look of bitter suffering onto his face. He said, "We're out of firewood at home. My mother can't even get a sip of hot water. I'm just here to gather some rotten bamboo to burn." As he spoke, he held out his calloused hands and rubbed them together. Zhao Erleng immediately felt a sense of superiority. He took his pitiful net pouch and dangled it in front of Zhou Chenglin, saying smugly, "Finding worms takes skill, you know. You could chop 10,000 of those black-skinned, rotten stalks and find nothing." Zhou Chenglin looked at the dozen or so toothpick-sized worms. He almost burst out laughing inside. "Is that all you've got?" It wasn't even as much as the leftovers from one of his bamboo stalks. But on his face, he put on a look of extreme admiration. Gulping, he praised Zhao Erleng for being so amazing. Zhao Erleng stared suspiciously at the basket behind Zhou Chenglin. He asked, "What's in there?" Zhou Qinglin's palms began to sweat, but his face remained as calm as ever. He deliberately turned sideways to reveal the basket. He reached in and rummaged around, saying, "It's nothing, just some rotten bamboo roots and dry leaves." As he spoke, he pulled out the top layer of camouflaging rotten branches, revealing the moldy, rotten wood underneath. A musty smell hit the air. Zhao Erleng recoiled, covering his nose in disgust. What a load of stinking junk. Only a poor bastard like you would treat it like treasure. Now get lost and go back to burning your rotten firewood. After saying that, he walked off humming a little tune, heading towards a patch of bamboo that looked lush and green, but was actually completely hollow. Watching Zhao Erleng walk away, Zhou Qinglin's tense body suddenly relaxed. His back was soaked with cold sweat. If he had been discovered just now, this entire bamboo grove would have been stripped bare by the whole village. This was no place to linger. Zhou Qinglin quickly put the hidden bamboo worms into his back basket. He covered them with rotten wood again, disguising it as a basket of worthless firewood. He hoisted the heavy basket onto his back, his calves trembling. But his heart felt more secure than ever. What he was carrying wasn't just worms. This was rice, this was pork, this was his mother's life-saving medicine. This was the first stepping stone for him, Zhou Qinglin, to stand tall. He avoided the main road, deliberately choosing a small, thorny path, and slipped down the mountain silently, hunched over. Coming down the thorny path from the back of the mountain, Zhou Qinglin's calves were cramping up. This body was just too weak. The basket weighed dozens of pounds, pressing down on him like a mountain, but he didn't stop. In fact, he walked faster and faster, with a cold wind blowing down his neck the whole way. Yet, his forehead was drenched in sweat. 2 hours later, the county town of 1983 appeared before his eyes, with its plain gray brick and tile houses. There were mottled, whitewashed slogans on the walls, and a large loudspeaker was blasting rousing songs. The bell of a passing 28-inch bicycle rang with a hint of arrogance. Zhou Qinglin was in no mood to admire the scenery. He pulled up the collar of his tattered cotton jacket to hide his face and expertly slipped into the back alley of the state-run canteen. In those years, there were many desperate people. If someone were to discover what was in his basket, it would be a disaster. It was the busiest time, right before the dinner rush. The clang of spatulas and shouting could be heard from the back kitchen. A chef so fat he had no neck was waving a large iron ladle, spitting as he berated a young apprentice who was as skinny as a monkey. He was yelling at him for going to the supply co-op to get pork lard and only coming back with this little bit of lean meat. This was Fatty Zhang, the man in charge of the best kitchen in the entire county. A loudspeaker was blasting rousing songs, and the bell of a passing 28-inch bicycle rang with a hint of arrogance. He said that a city official was coming for an inspection tonight and had specifically requested an impressive wild game dish. Right now, they didn't have any pheasant or rabbit. They didn't even have any fatty meat. If the official wasn't satisfied with his meal, all of their bonuses would be gone. Hiding behind a pile of coal, Zhou Qinglin's eyes lit up. This was a classic case of perfect timing. Fatty Zhang needed an impressive wild game dish, and what he had in his basket wasn't at the absolute best. Before he even got close, the aroma of braised pork mixed with oily smoke drifted towards him. It made Zhou Qinglin's stomach rumble, and a fire of hunger burned inside him. But he didn't dare move. He stayed hidden behind the coal pile, peeking inside. It was the busiest time, right before the dinner rush. The clang of spatulas and shouting could be heard from the back kitchen. A chef so fat he had no neck was waving a large iron ladle, spitting everywhere as he berated the skinny, monkey-like apprentice. A chef so fat he had no neck was waving a large iron ladle, spitting as he yelled. The skinny, monkey-like apprentice was being yelled at for going to the supply co-op to get pork lard, and only bringing back this pathetic piece of lean meat. This fatty was Fatty Zhang, the man in charge of the best kitchen in the county. The young apprentice, Xiao Li, explained that he'd arrived too late. The lard had already been bought up entirely by the textile factory's canteen. Fatty Zhang slammed the iron ladle down on the cutting board. He said that a city official was coming for an inspection tonight and had specifically requested an impressive wild game dish. Right now, they didn't have any pheasant or rabbit. They didn't even have any fatty meat. If the official wasn't satisfied with his meal, all of their bonuses would be gone. Hiding behind a pile of coal, Zhou Qinglin's eyes lit up. This was a classic case of perfect timing. Fatty Zhang needed an impressive wild game dish, and wasn't what he had in his basket the absolute finest. But he didn't rush out. Doing business is all about timing. Fatty Zhang is furious right now. Approaching him rashly would likely get you chased away like a beggar. He patiently waited until the young apprentice scurried off to wash vegetables. While Fatty was squatting by the door, frowning and chain-smoking, Zhou Qinglin straightened his clothes and walked over. His footsteps were light, stopping about 2 meters away. He lowered his voice and asked to borrow a light. Fatty Zhang jumped. He turned his head and saw a young man in a torn cotton jacket, carrying a worn-out basket. Looking like a beggar, he told him to get lost, saying there was no leftover food for him. Zhou Chenglin didn't get angry. Instead, he took a step closer. With a businessman's smile on his face, he said he wasn't looking for food. He'd heard Master Zhang had just lost his temper and asked if it was because he was short on an impressive dish. Fatty Zhang was stunned. He looked him up and down. Pointing at the basket with a skeptical look, he asked, "With that pile of rotten firewood?" Zhou Chenglin didn't waste words. He took off the basket, placed it gently on the ground and said, "Whether it's rotten firewood or not, you should take a look for yourself." He slowly pushed aside the rotten branches used as camouflage. He lifted a corner of the thick layer of dried bamboo leaves underneath. A few startled bamboo worms wriggled on the green moss, revealing their plump, gleaming white bodies. In the light, the cluster of bamboo worms, all huddled together, looked like moving white jade. Each one was as thick as a thumb, bursting with freshness. The cigarette butt in Fatty Zhang's hand dropped to the ground. His small eyes instantly widened into saucers. He couldn't help but curse. He squatted down, reaching out to touch them but in disbelief. He asked, "Are these bamboo worms? So fat and so many?" He was an expert. To catch a pile of these things was harder than climbing to heaven. Usually, the villagers would bring half a jin at most. But this basketful, it was like he dug up the ancestral grave of all bamboo worms. Fatty Zhang poked one. The worm immediately curled up. It was very strong. "They're alive?" Zhou Chenglin covered them with the bamboo leaves again. He said with a meaningful look, "Just came down from the mountain. All of them were chopped out of green bamboo. They're as fresh as can be." He asked, "Master Zhang, what these taste like when they're fried?" "I don't need to say more, do I? Serving a plate of these to the leaders, is that high class enough?" Fatty Zhang's face quivered with excitement. He said, "Enough? It's more than enough. These aren't worms, they're a lifeline. This is my bonus. If the leaders get a taste of this delicacy, even pheasant and wild rabbit will have to take a backseat." Fatty Zhang's attitude changed in an instant. He looked at him with the same fervor as if he were looking at the god of wealth. He asked how much there was. Zhou Chenglin said, "Around 20 jin." Fatty Zhang said he'd take it all. "Hurry, bring it inside. Don't let anyone see." They went into the storage room. After closing the door, Zhou Chenglin poured the goods into a large basin. The glistening white bamboo worms cascaded out like a stream of water, instantly covering the bottom of the basin. Fatty Zhang rubbed his hands together, drooling, and praised his skill. "How on earth did you get these?" he asked. Zhou Chenglin made something up on the spot. He said he got lucky and stumbled upon a diseased bamboo forest. Then he looked Fatty Zhang straight in the eye and asked about the price. Fatty Zhang's eyes shifted. He instinctively wanted to haggle the price down, saying, "After all, they're just worms. Normally, they're bought for 80 cents a jin." Zhou Chenglin didn't say a word. He reached out to take the basin back, saying that 80 cents was the price for small time sellers. This whole basin is to solve an emergency. If he thinks it's too expensive, he can just go and ask at the textile factory cafeteria. Fatty Zhang got anxious. He slammed a hand down on his, saying, 2 yuan. 2 yuan a jin, that was more than double the price of pork. Zhou Chenglin was bursting with joy inside. 2 yuan. In those days, pork was just over 80 cents. This was a sky-high price. But on the outside, he remained calm, pretending to agree reluctantly. Xiao Li came in with a scale. When he saw the basin full of glistening white grubs, he was so scared he almost threw the scale away. He put it on the scale to weigh. After tarring, the net weight was 21 jin and 3 liang. Fatty Zhang waved his hand grandly. "Forget the change, let's call it 21 jin for 42 yuan. He pulled out a crumpled wad of his personal stash and counted out 4 brand new 10 yuan bills. He then added 2 1 yuan bills and slapped the money into Zhou Chenglin's hand. Zhou Chenglin took the money. Its rough texture felt smoother than silk to him. 42 yuan. That was a huge sum of money. The people in his village could work themselves to death for a whole year. And their dividend would only be around 100 yuan. This basket of grubs was worth half a year's work points. He counted the money one more time, then stuffed it deep inside. He patted his chest over the pocket and said, "Money and goods are settled." Zhou Chenglin picked up the empty basket and turned to leave. Fatty Zhang hurriedly stopped him. "Hey, if you get more of this stuff in the future, bring it all directly to me. I'll buy as much as you can find." Zhou Chenglin turned back with a smile and said, "We'll see. It's up to luck. Who knows what things you find in the mountains." After leaving through the back door of the cafeteria, cold gust of wind hit him, and Zhou Chenglin realized his back was drenched in sweat. But he didn't feel cold at all. The money in his chest pocket felt like a small furnace, making his whole body burn with heat. Although his stomach was empty, that feeling of desperate weakness was gone. In its place was a sense of confidence. Having money meant rice, white flour, and pork. It meant the life-saving medicine for his mother. Zhou Chenglin turned into a dead-end alley and let out a long sigh of relief against the wall. He touched the thick wad of money in his coat again. Zhou Chenglin wasn't in a hurry to browse. First, he ducked into a public restroom, looking left and right. Seeing no one, he took out the huge sum of 42 yuan with trembling hands. He carefully folded the 4 large 10 yuan bills, and tucked them into a small cloth pocket sewn into the seam of his underwear. It was a secret anti-theft pocket his mother had specially made for him. The remaining 2 yuan in change he put in his outer pocket for convenience. It was easy to pull out anytime. After doing all this, he instantly felt more confident. He had money now, and it needed to be spent. He patted his rumbling stomach. He fought the urge to go to a restaurant for a bowl of shredded pork noodles and ran to a water tap instead, filling his stomach with cold water to curb his hunger. The Supply and Marketing Co-op in 1983. That was the grandest place in the whole county. It was crowded with people, a mix of smells from soy sauce, vinegar, and cold cream filling the air. The sales clerks all had their chins in the air, knitting sweaters, looking very stuck up. Zhou Chenglin pushed through the crowd with a clear goal in mind. He went straight for the non-staple foods counter and yelled to a heavy-set woman cracking melon seeds. "I want 5 jin of leaf lard, the kind at the negotiated price." Back then, everyone rushed to buy fatty meat, and leaf lard for rendering oil was an even more sought-after item. The stout lady gave the young man in his tattered clothes a strange look. 5 jin will be 6 yuan. Pay up first. Zhou Chenglin pretended to reach into his inner pocket. In reality, he pulled a large 10 yuan bill from a hidden layer of his padded jacket, slapped it on the counter, and said, "Keep the change. With the rest of the money, weigh out 2 jin of brown sugar. And get me 2 jin of refined salt." Seeing the cash, the stout lady's attitude changed in an instant. With a swift chop, she cut off a large, jade-white slab of pork fat. Zhou Chenglin took the heavy piece of meat. The greasy weight in his hands felt like pure happiness. He smiled and asked for a few sheets of oiled paper for wrapping pastries. He quickly wrapped the meat up like a bundle of explosives, making sure not a speck of white was showing so as not to reveal his wealth. If anyone saw this, the entire village would be at his door tomorrow, asking to borrow money. Next up was the main event, the grain and oil counter. Zhou Chenglin asked for 30 jin of premium rice, the very best polished kind. The salesman with glasses calculated the bill, 8 yuan and 40 cents. Zhou Chenglin pulled out another large 10 yuan bill. Gleaming white polished rice rustled as it poured into the burlap sack. This was food for his entire family. It was the hope that his old mother could finally have some thick rice porridge. After the rice was packed, Chenglin didn't tie the bag shut. Instead, he asked for 10 jin of the coarsest cornmeal. The salesman with the glasses was confused. A moment ago, this man was splurging on fine rice and pork fat. Why would he suddenly turn around and buy this throat-scratching coarse grain? Once the cornmeal was weighed, Zhou Chenglin did something astonishing. First, he took the wrapped 5 jin of pork fat, and the 2 jin of brown sugar, and shoved them all into the rice sack, pushing them with all his might to bury them at the very bottom. Then, he had the salesman pour the 10 jin of coarse cornmeal directly on top of everything. The golden coarse grain instantly concealed the treasures below, covering them up completely. Now, looking in from the opening of the sack, it looked like nothing more than a bag of the cheapest cornmeal. Anyone who reached in for a handful would only get coarse grain. The salesman with the glasses wondered aloud, mixing good rice with cornmeal. What a waste of good food. Zhou Chenglin just gave a simple, honest smile and said his family was poor. Mixing in some coarse grain helps stretch it out. Plus, with all the dust on the road, it's better to have this on top. He lifted the 40 to 50 jin basket onto his back, the weight nearly bending him in two. But his heart was soaring. Every step felt as light as walking on cotton. He felt so light and buoyant. This wasn't just grain, this was life itself. Once he was out of the county town, he stuck to the small footpaths between the fields. As he approached the stone bridge at the village entrance, a figure suddenly appeared. Zhou Chenglin cursed under his breath. It was Auntie Sun, the village's most notorious gossip, always green with envy. If a family so much as ate meat for dinner, she would go on about it for 3 days straight. It was too late to hide. Auntie Sun shouted from a distance, asking what he was doing with such a big basket on his back. She scurried over with quick little steps, her shifty eyes darting towards the basket. Zhou Chenglin deliberately bent over, pretending to be exhausted, and set the heavy basket down. He collapsed onto the ground, saying he'd gone to the city to borrow 10 yuan from a distant cousin. Auntie Sun immediately reached for the basket to rummage through it, asking what nice things he'd bought. Zhou Chenglin deliberately untied the sack and showed her, saying he'd spent all the money on cornmeal. I figured it's cheap and filling, otherwise we wouldn't make it through the coming days. Auntie Sun peeked inside and saw it was full of bright yellow, coarse cornmeal. It was even mixed with damp bran husks. She grabbed a handful. It was indeed the lowest quality grain. She dusted off her hands in disgust. Well, I suppose that makes sense. In his family's situation, They're lucky to even have cornmeal to eat. If you live by borrowing money, you'll starve to death sooner or later. After saying that, she walked off swaying her big hips, a gloating look on her face. Watching Sun walk away, the timid look in Zhou Chenglin's eyes vanished. The corner of his mouth curved into a cold sneer. Look down on me, will you? Fine, keep it up. Who would have guessed that beneath this layer of despised cornmeal was 5 jin of rich pork fat, 30 jin of rice, and brown sugar? He retightened the opening of the sack. He hoisted the basket onto his back. This time, it felt much lighter. The sun was setting and smoke from evening meals was rising. Zhou Chenglin quickened his pace. Like a victorious general returning from battle, he silently made his way back to that dilapidated, yet warm home. The sun had set. Zhou Chenglin scurried along the base of the wall like a mouse and slipped into the rundown courtyard. His younger sister, Xiao Mei, emerged holding a fire poker. She was so skinny she looked like an 8 or 9-year-old. Zhou Chenglin put a finger to his lips, shushing her. He told her to get inside and bolt the door shut. Startled, Xiao Mei quickly did as he said. He took off the basket and locked the main room's door from the inside. His mother, Wang Gafeng's weak voice called out, asking him why he was just now getting back. She said she'd left some wild vegetable soup in the pot for him. Zhou Chenglin paid no mind to the soup. He lit the kerosene lamp and called his mom and sister over. He untied the burlap sack, revealing the glistening white rice beneath. The main room seemed to instantly brighten. Wang Gafeng gasped, covering her mouth in shock. Zhou Chenglin didn't stop there. He took out an oil paper package. He tore it open. 5 jin of pork lard, 2 jin of brown sugar, and 2 bags of fine salt were laid bare before their eyes. There was a dead silence. Xiao Mei was drooling all down the front of her shirt. Wang Gafeng's legs gave out in fright, and she collapsed onto the floor, asking her son if he'd robbed the supply co-op. She said that being poor is one thing, but they couldn't resort to crime. In the eyes of this honest and simple farm woman, this pile of goods was an astronomical fortune. Zhou Chenglin took his mother's cold hand and told her that he had earned it. He said he got lucky and found a huge nest of bamboo worms, more than 20 jin of them. The chef at the state-run canteen happened to be in urgent need of them and bought them at a high price. He told his mother to never, ever tell a soul. Wealth should not be flaunted. Wang Gafeng was stunned. She asked if you could really sell worms for money. Zhou Chenglin said you could. City folks consider them a delicacy. Wang Gafeng's tears couldn't be stopped. She said that the heavens had finally shown them favor. Zhou Chenglin told Xiao Mei to stuff the cracks in the windows with old rags. Wang Gafeng started the fire. Tonight, they were rendering the pork lard. They were going to have plain rice, so she cut off half the lard and put it in the wok. There was no need to add any other oil. The aroma of the fat instantly exploded, filling the entire room as if it had grown legs. For people who've gone years without any fat in their diet, this was the most intense temptation. Xiao Mei stared intently at the pot, as if she wanted to inhale the very air. Cracklings were fried to a golden brown and scooped out. The rendered lard filled an entire jar. Leaving the remaining oil and some cracklings in the wok, she poured in the washed rice and water. After the rice and cracklings had simmered for half an hour, she lifted the lid. The overpowering aroma nearly blew the roof off the house. The fluffy white rice grains were perfectly distinct, each one coated in glistening pork. Fat and mixed with golden cracklings. The family of 3 gathered around. Their eyes were terrifyingly bright. Wang Gafeng picked up a piece of crackling with her chopsticks. She took a bite, and the rich fat burst in her mouth. Tears streamed down her face and into her bowl. This is delicious. So delicious, she said. If only their father were still here. Xiao Mei ate ravenously. It was so hot she was hissing, but she refused to spit it out, while Zhou Chenglin shoveled big mouthfuls of rice. Grease slid down his throat, bringing a warm, satisfying feeling of fullness. It made him feel as though he was finally alive again. Just then, the neighbor's dog started barking, and Zhao Erleng's chubby son was wailing that he wanted meat. It smells so good, Zhao Erleng's wife scolded him, saying it was just a smell carried on the wind. She told him to go to sleep. The atmosphere in the room instantly grew tense. Wang Gafeng's chopsticks froze in midair. In times like these, if people knew a widow and her orphans were eating meat, their doorstep would be worn through by morning. Zhou Chenglin peeked through a crack in the window. Luckily, the strong wind had scattered most of the smell. He turned around, his expression grave. Staring at Xiao Mei, he told her to put down her bowl. Xiao Mei trembled in fear. We didn't eat meat at home tonight. We ate wild vegetables and gruel. If you let it slip, our things will be stolen, and Mom will be taken away. The whole family will starve to death. Xiao Mei's face went white as a sheet. She nodded furiously, vowing she wouldn't say a word even if she were beaten to death. Zhou Chenglin then instructed his mother, when you go out, you have to complain about being poor. Wiping her tears, Wang Gafeng nodded, saying she knew and would act as if she were mute. They devoured everything in a flash, then washed the pot, hid the oil, and swept the floor. They even wiped the ashes from the stove 3 times. Late at night, Zhou Chenglin lay on the earthen bed. Rubbing his round belly, he finally felt at ease. But he knew this was just the beginning. He closed his eyes, and that magical radar reappeared in his mind. This time, the target wasn't bamboo worms. In his memory, a green cursor was flashing deep within the bamboo forest. What was that? A smile of anticipation touched Zhou Chenglin's lips as he drifted into a deep sleep. Tomorrow, he would venture deep into the mountains. He slept soundly through the night. Last night's meal of rice mixed with pork cracklings was like a stimulant, awakening his gaunt body. Waking early, Zhou Chenglin grabbed a few handfuls of crispy rice and cracklings to fill his stomach, then took a small hoe and a tattered sack. With a basket on his back, he slipped out of the house unnoticed. If he wanted a steady income, harvesting bamboo worms was too slow. He needed to find something more valuable. Just as he reached the large pagoda tree at the village entrance, he ran into Auntie's son carrying a urine bucket. Zhao Erleng only caught Tu Liang yesterday. With a skinny frame like yours, try not to faint up in the mountains. Everyone says your family is just living off borrowed grain and waiting to die. And since you're idle anyway, what if a blind cat happens upon a dead mouse? Auntie's son let out a cackle. I'm off, Zhou Chenglin said, then spat. Old gossip, he thought, sooner or later, I'll give you something to really pop your eyes at. Avoiding the ravaged outer groves, Zhou Chenglin headed straight for the deep mountains. Activating his see-through vision, scattered white lights began to flicker into view. He chose the biggest ones to cut down. In less than half an hour, he had 3 or 4 caddies of bamboo worms in the bottom of his basket. Too slow. This efficiency was terrible. At this rate, making enough money to build a house would take forever. He took a deep breath. He focused his mind, and his field of vision instantly extended. As he scanned the shady dirt slope ahead, a strange ball of light suddenly jumped out at him. Model. It was a vibrant emerald green, like a piece of fine jade buried in the earth. The glowing aura was several times larger than a bamboo worm's, and it was moving slowly. A white glow is common, but a green one is rare. The creature burrowing in there was huge. A bamboo rat. Definitely the king of these mountains. They feed on bamboo roots and drink the morning dew, so their meat is incredibly tender and delicious. Their fur is practically soft gold. A single adult weighs at least 3 or 4 pounds. That's all solid meat. Zhou Chenglin's eyes burned with excitement. This was way more exciting than catching bugs. He crept closer, using his special vision. In his vision, the green glow was resting in a burrow about a meter deep, with 2 small ones next to it. 3 or 4 more, each the size of a fist. Wow, the whole family's here. Using the experience from his past life, Zhou Chenglin quickly located the hidden air vents and escape tunnels. He sealed them shut with large rocks. They were completely trapped. He went back to the main entrance and spat into his palms. Then he got to work, his hoe flying. Underground, the large male rat was startled and tried to flee. It slammed right into a blocked exit, then started scurrying around in a panic. After digging half a meter down, a musty, pungent smell wafted out, along with the sound of grinding teeth. The sound was enough to set your teeth on edge. Zhou Chenglin tossed his hoe aside. He grabbed his machete and hacked through the final layer of dirt. A huge bamboo rat, as plump as a piglet, was suddenly exposed to the sunlight. It had grayish-brown fur, and its 2 small eyes glinted menacingly. It bared a pair of large, orange-yellow buck teeth at him in defiance. It had to weigh at least 4 or 5 pounds. Behind it, a mother rat trembled, shielding a few pink, chubby pups. The male rat suddenly kicked off its hind legs and lunged, its mouth wide open to bite. But in his special vision, its movements were half a beat too slow. Zhou Chenglin's machete struck it with perfect timing. The male rat was sent spinning, dazed, its legs twitching. Zhou Chenglin snatched it by the scruff of its neck and hoisted it up. It was heavy, all solid meat. He expertly tossed it into his burlap sack. Then, he scooped up the mother and her pups all in one go. This was a huge score. The 2 large bamboo rats weighed 7 or 8 pounds, and that's not even counting the little ones. Their value was far greater than the bamboo worms. As a seasoned pro, he knew he had to cover his tracks perfectly. He made sure to step only on rocks on his way out. He covered the area with dead leaves and rotten branches, and even propped up the bamboo shoots he'd disturbed. The camouflage was so good, not even a god could tell this spot had been cleaned out. He stuffed the still squirming sack into his pack basket. He packed the bamboo worms and some old firewood on top to hide it. Then, Zhou Chenglin heaved the heavy basket onto his back. He was so pleased, he started humming a little tune. This felt just like finding free money. He was just coming down from the mountain, not yet in the village, when he saw a few people gathered around the broken gate of his courtyard. Sun Jung stood there with his hands on his hips, pointing at the gate and ranting at a few of the village gossips, spit flying everywhere. Zhou Chenglin's heart sank. Oh no, that pack of jealous busybodies. What kind of trouble were they stirring up now? His expression darkened, he hitched the basket higher on his back and quickened his pace. If anyone dared to mess with his livelihood, he was ready to fight them to the death. Zhou Chenglin adjusted his basket again, schooling his features into a miserable expression. He shuffled back towards the village. HMPH, always sneaking off into the mountains. What's that weird smell on you? Are you hiding something good? Give me a break, you've all seen the state my family is in. Even a rat would come out of there in tears. Last night, it was Xiao Mei who burned the rotten sweet potatoes. He tilted his back basket, showing them the thick layer of junk on top. The bamboo rats and bamboo worms underneath were covered up securely by nothing but rotten firewood. Losing interest, the crowd dispersed. Zhou Chenglin acted meek and submissive, nodding and bowing, waiting until they were far away. His back instantly straightened, and his eyes grew cold. They all want to laugh at him? Let them dream on for the rest of their lives. He pushed the door into the courtyard and bolted it, shutting the gossip outside. Xiao Mei ran out, but Zhou Chenglin didn't offer much of an explanation. Carrying the basket, he went into the cellar and untied the opening of the sack. Bamboo rats thrashed around wildly. Xiao Mei screamed, "Why did you bring these filthy things home?" "These are the bamboo rats from my past life. This litter can sell for dozens of yuan." Hearing the word money, Wang Gafeng's stick froze. Zhou Chenglin settled the bamboo rats in an old metal barrel. Sitting on the threshold and smoking, Zhou Chenglin's brow was tightly furrowed. There were more and more valuables in the house. A broken lock wasn't enough to protect them. When I go deep into the mountains, I also need a helper. I have to get a dog. Not only can it guard the house, but it can also help hunt in the mountains. Early the next morning, Zhou Chenglin tucked a large bundle of cash into his clothes and rushed to the dog market in Hongqi town. He looked at 7 or 8 stalls. He activated his perspective eye. They all just had a faint white light. Ordinary mutts just wouldn't do. Just as he was getting disappointed, in a corner of the market, next to a pile of trash, a young beggar had a half-dead little black dog tied up. It caught his attention. The dog was nothing but skin and bones. People were pointing and muttering, saying it was a dead dog. Zhou Chenglin swept his gaze over it from the corner of his eye, and his footsteps halted abruptly. A sharp ringing buzzed in his head. That little black dog was actually emitting a faint red halo. Red means it's top grade. Under his perspective eye, the dog's skeleton was huge, its spine like a dragon's. Its heart beat powerfully, and deep in its throat, a red light was gathering, pushing against a blockage. Zhou Chenglin suppressed his ecstasy and feigned disgust. He walked over and asked, "Selling a dead dog?" The young beggar protectively shielded the puppy, saying, "He's not dead. His mother was killed by a wolf. He's the only one left. He's the type that would fight a wolf to the death." Zhou Chenglin threw down 50 cents, playing hard to get. The young beggar got anxious and yelled, "1 yuan." In the end, he bought it for 1 yuan. Zhou Chenglin picked up the light as a feather black puppy and placed it in his basket. He then bought some scraps of meat and skin to feed it. The puppy smelled the meat. Its eyes instantly flew wide open, and it devoured it in one gulp. Seeing that fierce spirit, Zhou Chenglin nodded in approval. He named him Da He. He told him that from now on, he'd eat meat at every meal. On the way back to the village, he ran into Zhao Erleng and the others. They jeered, a scrap collector with a sick dog he picked up off the street. What a perfect match. Just seeing if he can guard the house. No one knew that this mangy dog would one day become the Black Fiend, whose name alone would make wild beasts tremble in fear. That night, after closing the doors, Zhou Chenglin cooked pork liver and rice soup to feed Da He. Through his perspective eye, he saw the red glow on its body repairing it. Zhou Chenglin gazed at the night outside the window. His gaze was deep. Grow up fast, Da He. Once he's all healed up, we'll head deep into the mountains. That place will be our kingdom. 3 days went by, and besides chopping for bamboo worms, Zhou Chenglin was completely focused on Da He, feeding him rice water mixed with pork liver for every meal. He even secretly fed him lard. If the villagers saw, they'd definitely call him a spendthrift. But in his eyes, this was an investment in a top-grade red cursor. Its recovery power was astonishing. In just 3 days, Da He's fur was glossy black, and his eyes glinted menacingly. He wouldn't bark, he'd just bite. Early that morning, Zhou Chenglin grabbed his gear and woke up Da He. Their destination was the deep mountains of Tiger Head Ridge. It was a primeval forest that even seasoned hunters dared not enter lightly. With his perspective vision, he could see where the dangers were and where the treasures lay. It was all clear at a glance. After venturing into the deep mountains for 2 hours, he was surrounded by towering ancient trees, and the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of rotten leaves. With his perspective vision activated, the world was a kaleidoscope of colors. There were plenty of white and green cursors, but Zhou Chenglin didn't stop. He was looking for something truly valuable. He pressed on for over another hour. Just as he was climbing a steep, shady rock face, that familiar buzzing suddenly roared in his mind. He looked up and saw a ball of golden light, like a blazing sun, erupting from a crevice in the sheer cliff more than 20 meters high. Gold meant it was the legendary wild ginseng, an old root at least 100 years old. Zhou Chenglin's hands and feet were trembling. In the future, this stuff would be sold by the gram. Even now, it could sell for thousands, the entire fortune of several wealthy families. The spot was too treacherous, only someone with perspective vision could have found it. He tied on his hemp rope and began to climb. When he was just 5 or 6 meters from the golden light, he heard a dog barking and a voice from below. Someone was shouting for Da Huang. What's all that racket for? Zhou Chenglin's heart sank. It was Hunter Ma. The man carried a homemade rifle. He had a dark heart and was ruthless. If he saw the wild ginseng, he would commit murder and robbery out here in these deep, ancient woods without a trace. There was no time to hide. Zhou Chenglin's mind raced. He undid his belt, pulling his pants down to expose his backside. Pretending to be taking a crap, he poked his head out and yelled, "Don't shoot." "It's me, Chenglin from Qingxi village." Hunter Ma aimed his rifle, and looking annoyed, asked him what he was doing taking a crap in this godforsaken place. Zhou Chenglin put on a pained expression. As he pulled up his pants, he said he had an upset stomach. "I was only halfway done. When you scared the other half back up." Hunter Ma looked disgusted. He waved his hand in disgust and told him to hurry up and get lost. "And don't scare off my wild boar." Watching the man and his dog walk away, Zhou Chenglin's back was soaked in a cold sweat. Fortune is found in peril. Now that they were gone, this treasure would have the surname Zhou. He carefully climbed over. He pushed aside the weeds. 5 leaves sat atop a red stem. It really was an old ginseng root. Zhou Chenglin used a bamboo stick to carefully pick away the soil. He didn't even dare to breathe too loudly, digging for over a full hour. Finally, he managed to ease the entire human-shaped old ginseng root out. It was a perfect specimen, not even a single fine root was broken. This was his family's lifeline. This was a house of brick and tile. It's a tractor. It's a lifetime of wealth and prosperity. He wrapped it carefully in bark and moss and tucked it into his padded jacket. It felt secure against his skin. His legs were weak as he went down the mountain. Like a thief, he slipped through the bushes. Once home, he shut the door, locked it, and drew the curtains. He lit the kerosene lamp and unwrapped the bark. The wild mountain ginseng, radiating with spiritual energy, lay there quietly. Wang Gafeng trembled. She asked if it was a wild ginseng, if it was real. Zhou Chenglin lowered his voice and said sternly, "This thing is 1,000 times more valuable than bamboo worms or bamboo rats. You must take this secret to your grave. Don't speak of it, not even in your dreams. Otherwise, it could get us killed." Wang Gafeng was so scared she almost knocked over the kerosene lamp. That night, the family of 3 acted like thieves, hiding the iron box with the ginseng inside a heavy pickle jar. Zhou Chenglin slumped to the floor, staring at the dusty jar. A smile crept onto his lips. This was his nuclear weapon. It was his ace in the hole. When the time came, this ginseng root could turn Fengzhou County upside down. But for now, he was still that poor kid, Zhou Chenglin. No one could see through him. At the end of October, Qingxi village was plagued by boars. A herd of wild boars came down from the mountains in droves. They ravaged the crops like bulldozers. The villagers banged gongs and drums to stand guard at night. They were just being made fools of. Zhou Chenglin didn't join the commotion. He hid in the cellar every day, feeding Da He extra meals. Half a month later, Da He was completely transformed. Its body was stout and strong, its eyes fierce. Under his X-ray vision, a steady red glow emanated from deep in its throat. Its heart was powerful. Now, it could take on a hunting dog without a problem. Zhou Chenglin felt Da He's muscles. He sneered and told it, "Don't be impatient. It'll be soon." He was waiting for the villagers to be pushed to their limit. That evening, the village party secretary announced a meeting over the broadcast. In the commune headquarters, the old secretary pointed at the ruined cornstalks and a dead chicken, roaring, "These beasts, they're trying to wipe us out. Whoever can kill a wild boar will be awarded a special merit. Half the pork will be yours to keep. That's over 100 pounds of pork. That's worth several hundred yuan." The villagers' eyes turned green with greed. They scattered in an uproar to get their tools. Zhou Chenglin went home. He grabbed his wickedly sharp wood knife and a hardwood spear, and led Da He out into the night, heading for the east end of the village. He didn't go where the others were, but instead circled around to a path the wild boars had to use to get up a mountain. It was a patch of wasteland. He climbed a tree, while Da He lay hidden in the grass. Half an hour later, his X-ray vision radar vibrated. They were here. 7 or 8 red blips appeared like will-o'-the-wisps. In the middle was a huge blip, so red it was almost purple. It stood out from the rest. The Boar King, a biological tank of at least 400 pounds. The herd went into the fields to eat the crops, while the Boar King stood guard like a general. Zhou Chenglin held his breath, waiting for a chance to pick one off. Finally, a male boar of about 150 pounds, thinking the corn wasn't tender enough, started rooting around under his tree. Now, Zhou Chenglin hissed. He sent Da He in and leapt down from the tree. Da He shot out like a black bolt of lightning and bit down on the boar's tail. Yanking with all its might, the wild boar squealed in pain. Turning its head to expose its neck, Zhou Chenglin used the momentum. Gripping the spear with both hands, aimed for the red dot over the major artery and stabbed down viciously. The spear slid into the artery like it was cutting through butter. He gave it a hard kick. Scalding blood sprayed all over his face. The wild boar let out a piercing shriek. It threw off the spear and Zhou Chenglin. A dying beast is the most fearsome of all. Its eyes were bloodshot as it charged toward Zhou Chenglin like an out-of-control truck. At that critical moment, Da He leapt in from the side without a second thought. He bit down on the boar's ear, halting its charge. The boar flung Da He aside, but that 1 second was enough. Zhou Chenglin fumbled for his wood knife and, instead of retreating, charged forward. With a furious roar, he met the boar's head and swung down with all his might. The blade bit deep into its neck, getting lodged in the bone. The boar's enormous body sent Zhou Chenglin flying before it collapsed to the ground with a thud. The 150 jin beast convulsed. Zhou Chenglin spat out a mouthful of bloody foam. Limping heavily, he staggered over to Da He's side and gave the dog's head a rough, affectionate rub. He praised him for being a good boy. In the distance, torches were bobbing. The villagers, drawn by the screams, were coming closer. Zhou Chenglin plopped down on the dead boar's body. He lit a crumpled cigarette and took a deep drag. The torchlight and flashlight beams gathered as the old village chief arrived with the villagers. When the first beam of light fell on Zhou Chenglin, everyone gasped in shock. Under the large tree, the grass was trampled flat and spattered with blood. Zhou Chenglin was covered from head to toe in mud and blood, panting heavily. At his feet lay the enormous black beast, its eyes rolled back in its head. Its neck was frothing with blood, it was as dead as could be. The old village chief's hand was trembling so much he could barely hold the flashlight. He asked if he was the one who killed it. Zhou Chenglin, who had already rehearsed his act, began to tremble uncontrollably. With a quiver in his voice, he said that he had just brought Da He out to try his luck when this beast suddenly charged at them. Thanks to Da He biting its tail, it turned around to go after the dog. Then it slipped and crashed right into a tree. Everyone looked over at the old elm tree, which had a patch of bark scraped off. They seemed to believe him, but Zhao Erlang questioned, "It just crashed into a tree?" "That's stupid," Zhou Chenglin continued. "It hit so hard it couldn't even stand up straight. I panicked and just started jabbing it with a stick with all my might. When it tried to charge again, I just started swinging my wood knife blindly." There were 2 seconds of silence, and then the crowd exploded with chatter. Some said it was pure dumb luck, while others said that fortune favors the foolish. Hunter Ma inspected the wounds. The spear had pierced the major artery, and the wood knife delivered the final blow. It was certainly plausible. He praised Zhou Chenglin for his good luck, saying that the stab was a clean one. The meat will be delicious. With Hunter Ma's endorsement, everyone believed the story completely. Zhou Chenglin secretly breathed a sigh of relief. He had passed the test. The old village chief was grinning from ear to ear. He told a few strong men to carry it back. He announced they would butcher the pig and share the meat tonight. The 168 jin boar was carried back to the threshing ground. Zhou Chenglin, leading the limping Da He, basked in the admiring gazes of the entire village. Zhao Erlang muttered sourly, "What a waste," adding that he could have done it himself. Zhou Chenglin scoffed. Without Da He's life or death struggle and his own X-ray vision, he'd be a dead man by now. The threshing ground was brightly lit. The old party secretary announced that half would be turned in for a communal stew. The other half, along with the offal and the pig's head, would go to Zhou Chenglin. The crowd erupted. Half is 84 jin of meat. That's several hundred yuan. Zhao Erlang and Sun Shen jeered, saying, "Why should he get half? It should be divided among the whole village." The old party secretary roared, "Just now, who was cowering with their necks pulled in while he was the one who killed it? Why shouldn't we give it to him? Who's been spreading rumors? Don't even think about getting any of the pig slaughter feast tomorrow." The village party secretary's authority still held weight. The hecklers backed down. Old Joe the butcher raised his knife and brought it down in one swift motion. With half a pig, the head, and the offal all set aside, old Joe asked Zhou Chenglin if he wanted to take it now or tomorrow. Looking at the green, envious eyes all around him, Zhou Chenglin made a snap decision and said he'd carry it back right now. With a mountain of meat weighing over 100 jin on his shoulder, Zhou Chenglin gritted his teeth, hefted the huge dark mass, held his head high, and forged a path forward. When he got home, Wang Gafeng and Xiao Mei stared dumbfounded at the mountain of meat, then burst into tears of joy. Zhou Chenglin said they'd braise the pig's head tonight for a taste. Just as the family was celebrating, Zhou Chenglin quietly walked into the yard and activated his X-ray vision. At the foot of the neighbor's wall, Zhao Erleng was furtively eavesdropping. Zhou Chenglin picked up a stone and threw it hard at the top of the wall. Zhao Erleng fled in panic. Zhou Chenglin clapped his hands, went inside, and shut the door. Tonight was just the beginning. This pig was the first step in establishing his authority. Next, the distribution of the meat was just getting started. Early the next morning, the air in Qingxi village was filled with a meaty aroma so enticing it could stop you in your tracks. At the entrance of the brigade's mess hall, that large iron pot that had hardly ever seen a drop of grease was finally getting some real meat today. That half of the tough wild boar meat had been chopped by old Joe the butcher into large chunks, bones and all. It was bubbling away in the big pot, with plenty of Chinese cabbage and vermicelli added. There were also dried red chili peppers, although there was more vegetable than meat. But for these villagers who went year-round without seeing much meat, this was like celebrating the new year. But some people had no interest in that aroma. Their eyes were all fixed on the dilapidated courtyard gate of Zhou Chenglin's home. Zhou Chenglin woke up earlier than the chickens. The more than 80 jin of meat he had carried back yesterday, plus a large pig's head and a set of offal, would spoil if not processed quickly. He took down the main room's door panel to use as a cutting board, placing the razor-sharp wood chopping knife by his side. Zhou Chenglin was shirtless, revealing his lean yet sturdy back. He held a piece of pork belly in his hand, rubbing Sichuan pepper powder on it. He asked, "Mom, is the salt roasted yet?" Wang Gafang came over carrying a basin of coarse salt, roasted until yellow, and giving off a toasted aroma. She said, "It's still hot." He was in exceptionally high spirits today, and the color had returned to his face. He even had a spring in his step. Zhou Chenglin grabbed a handful of hot salt and rubbed it forcefully onto the pork. The coarse salt grains made a rustling sound as they scraped against the pigskin. That was the sound of wealth. In those days, there were no refrigerators. To make the meat last long, you had to cure it. Of these 80+ jin of meat, aside from a few jin set aside to be eaten now, the rest had to be salted and hung from the rafters to air dry. That would be the Zhou family's security for the entire winter. Just as mother and son were bustling with activity, the sound of shuffling footsteps came from outside the courtyard gate. Before Zhou Chenglin could answer, the courtyard gate was pushed open. The one leading the way was Widow Qian from the east end of the village, followed by the gossipy son, and at the very back, Zhao Erleng, chewing on a foxtail grass model. He sauntered over lazily, his shifty eyes scanning the meat on the cutting board. The moment son entered the house, his eyes were glued to the meat and wouldn't move. He sniffed the air dramatically and said, "That's so much meat. How can a mother and son possibly finish it all? Aren't you afraid it'll spoil?" Zhou Chenglin didn't stop what he was doing. Without looking up, he replied, "It won't spoil. We'll just add more salt and cure it into preserved meat. We can save it for the new year and eat it slowly." Then he asked, "Auntie son, why aren't you lining up at the canteen for the pork stew this early in the morning? What brings you here?" Sun curled her lip and said, "What's so great about that stew from the big pot? You only get 2 small pieces of meat per person. It's not even enough to fill the gaps between your teeth." Then, her face instantly bloomed into a smile like a chrysanthemum. She sidled up to the cutting board and reached out to touch the best cut of hindquarter meat. Before her hand could even touch the meat, it was blocked by the cleaver in Zhou Chenglin's hand. Sun yelped in fright, snatching her hand back and scolding him, "What are you doing, waving knives around?" Zhou Chenglin looked at her coldly and said, "My hands are greasy and slippery." He told Sun to just say what she wanted to say and not to get handsy. Sun swallowed hard and said with a sheepish grin that her husband's back had been hurting these past few days. She said he wanted to eat some fatty meat to get his strength back, asking if she could borrow 2 pounds. She promised to pay it back double after they butchered their own pig at the end of the year. Before Zhou Chenglin could speak, Zhao Erleng from next door also squeezed his way in and said, "Borrow? Why borrow? We're all neighbors here." He said, now that Zhou Chenglin has struck it rich, he can't possibly forget his old neighbors. He should show some goodwill and just give me that pig's heart. He claimed he'd been having chest pains recently and wanted to nourish his heart. The few women behind him also started chiming in, saying they had even held him when he was a baby. "Surely you can't refuse us this small favor?" Seeing this crowd of villagers acting like a pack of hungry wolves, Wang Gafang started to panic. She was an honest person, and her biggest fear was offending people. Now that everyone had asked, she subconsciously reached for the knife to start cutting meat. But suddenly, Zhou Chenglin let out a sharp yell. He told his mother to take the salt basin into the back room. Wang Gafang jumped in fright, nearly dropping the basin in her hands. Zhou Chenglin stood up straight. He twirled the cleaver in his hand, and the glint of the cold blade momentarily dazzled everyone's eyes. He ignored the women and turned his head to look at Zhao Erleng. A mocking smile played on his lips. He picked up the pig's heart. weighing it in his hand, and said, "This pig's heart is a good thing. It's true that eating it is nourishing. But yesterday, the village secretary made it very clear. I earned this meat by risking my life. It's a reward from the village." The village secretary also gave special instructions. If anyone dares to have any ideas about this meat, they'd be undermining our collective efforts. As soon as they heard the words village secretary, the people who had just been clamoring immediately shrank back. Zhou Chenglin continued, "Yesterday, when the wild boar charged, how come I didn't see any of you cheering me on? What I did see was Zhao Erleng running faster than a rabbit, looking like he wanted to dive into a rat hole." Zhao Erleng's face turned beet red. "You, stop spouting nonsense. I was going to get help." Zhou Chenglin snorted coldly. "Get help? I think you were going to get your soul scared out of you." Zhou Chenglin fiercely slammed the cleaver down on the cutting board. "You want to eat meat? Fine, go line up at the canteen. That's public property. That's what you're entitled to. This meat here is my private property, something I, Zhou Chenglin, earned with my life. Anyone who wants a free handout better ask this knife first, and then ask if his Da He agrees." The big black dog, who was lying right under the table, suddenly shot out. After being fed for a few days, the little fella wasn't big, but he had already developed a fierce streak. He bared his teeth, a low growl rumbling from his throat, as he stared intently at Zhao Erleng's thigh, looking ready to take another bite at any moment. Zhao Erleng had been bitten by this dog yesterday and was traumatized. He was so scared he stumbled back 3 steps, nearly tripping over the threshold and falling flat on his face. Zhao Erleng pointed at Zhou Chenglin, cursing loudly to hide his fear, saying that just because he had a little bit of meat, he'd forgotten his own name. He said they were all from the same village, so he shouldn't be so ruthless. What goes around comes around. He said he didn't believe Zhou Chenglin would go his whole life without needing help from others. Sun also chimed in with an insult. He called him stingy, saying if you're not going to give it, then just say so. Who are you trying to scare with that knife? He said that in the future, if their family had any issues, big or small, they shouldn't expect any help from them. But Zhou Chenglin wasn't buying any of it. He slammed the main gate shut with a loud bang. A stream of curses could be heard from outside, which gradually faded away. Wang Gafeng was a bit worried. She asked if they had just offended everyone, and how they would get by in the village from now on. Zhou Chenglin put down the knife, and the fierce look on his face vanished. It was replaced by a gentle expression. He helped his mother sit down. He said that some people in this world are like untamable wolves. The weaker you act, the more they'll try to walk all over you. So what if they're offended? We don't depend on people like them to get by. Then, he changed his tone. He said they couldn't burn all their bridges, though. They'd only give to the honest folks. Only to those who have been good to them. After saying that, he picked up the knife. He cut 2 large strips from the best piece of pork belly, weighing a good 3 or 4 pounds. He also cut off more than half of the pig's liver. Then, he found a few sheets of clean oiled paper. He wrapped the meat and the liver separately. He asked his mom to take 1 piece of meat to Uncle Lee next door. He said that when they were carrying the pig yesterday, Uncle Lee helped the most. And he didn't join in on the heckling. The other piece of meat was for third uncle, down the main street. He said that when their roof was leaking, it was third uncle who helped fix it. And he didn't even charge them. He would personally take the pig's liver to the village party secretary. He said that if they wanted to get a firm footing in the village, they'd need to rely on that big tree. Hearing her son's well-thought-out plans, Wang Gafeng felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She praised him for being so thoughtful and said she would go right away. Zhou Chenglin left with the package of pig's liver, but he didn't take the main road. Instead, he went around to the old party secretary's backyard. The old secretary was squatting in his yard, smoking his pipe, watching his wife feed the chickens, even though that wild boar yesterday had brought him a lot of prestige. As the village party secretary, he had only received an extra bowl of broth. They were still short on hearty food at home. Zhou Chenglin, with a wide grin, poked his head through the back gate to say hello. As soon as the old secretary saw who it was, his face broke into a wide smile. He asked him what brought him here. Shouldn't you be at home curing your meat? What are you doing over here? Zhou Chenglin walked into the yard and looked around to make sure no one was there. Only then did he pull out the oiled paper package from his coat and discreetly slip it into the old secretary's hand. He lowered his voice and said that thankfully, the old party secretary had stood up for him yesterday. Otherwise, that jealous bunch would have definitely snatched all his meat. This is the pig liver I just prepared. It's the freshest. Specially saved a piece for the old party secretary so he can take it and have someone stir-fry it. A nice dish to go with drinks and build up his strength. The old party secretary squeezed the oil paper package in his hand. It was soft and flat, and it wasn't light. This was pig liver, a delicacy even more prized than meat. The old party secretary politely refused, saying that he had risked his life for it. How could I possibly accept? Zhou Chenglin had a look of utter sincerity. He said there was no need for such formalities between them, and that he'd still need the old party secretary to look out for him in the village. If he didn't accept it, it would mean he was looking down on him. Zhou Chenglin, the old party secretary, looked at Zhou Chenglin's perceptive eyes. He felt quite pleased and said, "All right then, I'll be shameless and accept it." He said meaningfully for Zhou Chenglin not to worry, that in Qingxi village, as long as he was around to eat, no one would dare bully the widow and orphan. If that Zhao Erleng dared to cause trouble at his house again, just watch how he would deal with him. Zhou Chenglin chuckled and said that with the old party secretary's promise, he could finally rest easy. After exchanging a few pleasantries, he said his goodbyes and left. After leaving the village secretary's house, the smile still hadn't faded from Zhou Chenglin's face. Gifting that packet of pig liver was worth it. In a society that runs on relationships, brute strength alone isn't enough. You also need a powerful backer. He had now firmly latched onto the big tree. That was the party secretary. In the future, if he did anything out of line in the village, he'd have a shield to protect him. Back home, Wang Gafeng had also returned from delivering meat. Uncle Li's and third uncle's families had accepted their shares. They were immensely grateful, and even gave a basket of eggs and a bag of dried sweet potatoes in return. This was a normal exchange of favors. Xiao Mei's hands were covered in salt. She excitedly pointed to the strings of pork hanging from the beam and said they were all cured. The crossbeam in the main room was densely hung with red and white strips of meat. It looked like a curtain of meat. Inside the house, the unique aroma of peppercorns and raw meat filled the air. Zhou Chenglin looked at all the meat. The sense of satisfaction he felt was simply indescribable. This was what made life worth living. After breakfast, Zhou Chenglin didn't rest. He processed the remaining large pig's head. The bristles on a pig's head are thick and difficult to remove. He used red-hot fired tongs to singe the hair off until it was perfectly clean. Then he split the entire pig's head open and tossed it into a large iron pot to braise. He added dark soy sauce, star anise, and cinnamon, all of which he had gathered himself from the mountains. He brought it to a boil over high heat, then let it simmer slowly on low. By noon, the entire courtyard was filled with the rich aroma of braised meat. The aroma was so powerful that it drifted far away on the wind. 2 li away, Zhao Erleng was holding a bowl of thin congee with only a few vegetable leaves in it when he smelled the aroma. He got so angry he smashed the bowl. He paced back and forth in his courtyard, cursing, "Those who eat alone will rot," and telling Zhou Chenglin to just wait. If he didn't turn his house completely upside down, then his surname wasn't Zhao. Meanwhile, Zhou Chenglin was sitting on his doorstep, holding a freshly braised pig's tail in his hand. While eating with his mouth full of grease, he teased Da He by his feet. His X-ray vision activated, penetrating 7 courtyard walls. He clearly saw Zhao Erleng's flustered and exasperated expression. Zhou Chenglin let out a cold laugh and spat out a bone. "If he wants to bring me down, that's perfect. I'm looking for someone to make an example of." He felt the few hundred yuan in his coat. The bamboo worm business was done. He had raised bamboo rats and killed a wild boar. He had dug up ginseng. The Zhou Chenglin of today had enough capital to do something bigger. But in this small mountain village, no matter how much money you had, it was just enough to buy meat. To truly build a fortune, to build the kind of big brick house that the whole village would admire, he needed a bigger stage. Zhou Chenglin tossed the remaining half of the pig's tail to Da He. He asked him if he was full. If he was, they were heading to the city. He said they weren't going to sell worms this time, they were going for something big. He stood up, his gaze turning toward the distant county town. There was a place there that could turn the wild boar pelt and gallbladder in his hands into real money, and besides, he had something even more important to do: buy that piece of land. As they entered the last month of the lunar year, the days grew colder. The northwest wind cut like a knife, stinging his face. Zhou Chenglin wore his old, heavily patched cotton jacket. On his head, he wore a lei feng hat, with both hands tucked into his sleeves. He walked with his neck hunched down the main street of the county town. Da He stuck close to his leg, his bright black eyes warily watching the pedestrians. Occasionally, a low growl rumbled in his throat, scaring passers-by into giving them a wide berth. Someone remarked that the dog looked really fierce. "Looks like a wolf," telling others to stay away. "You don't want to get bitten." Zhou Chenglin paid no mind to the idle chatter. His purpose today was clear: make money, save money. Although he had saved 100 or so yuan in the past half-month selling bamboo worms and rats, and with the money from the sale to Fatty Zhang, his family didn't have to worry about daily life. But to build the kind of large, tiled roof house that the entire village would envy, and to lease that barren land on the back mountain, this little bit of money was nowhere near enough. He felt inside his coat. 2 items were tucked inside. One was a wild boar's gallbladder, wrapped in several layers of oil paper. He had saved it specifically from the last time he killed the boar, and it was his most valuable treasure. The other was a freshly treated wild boar hide, rolled up into a bundle. Stuffed into his bag basket, Zhou Chenglin, knowing the way by heart, turned into a secluded alley. At the end of it was a traditional Chinese medicine shop, Ji Shi Tang. The shop had been around for years, the paint on its sign was peeling. But the resident doctor inside was a true connoisseur. Pushing aside the heavy cotton door curtain, a thick aroma of Chinese herbs wafted out. Behind the counter, an old man wearing reading glasses was weighing herbs with a small scale. Without looking up, the old man asked if he was there for medicine or a consultation. Zhou Chenglin said he was selling something. He put down his bag basket, told Da He to sit and wait by the door, and took the oil paper package out from his coat. He gently placed it on the counter. The old man pushed up his glasses. He casually reached out to unwrap it, saying that wild ones were hard to come by these days. Before he could finish his sentence, the oil paper package was opened. A wild boar's gallbladder, purple-black and the size of a pear, lay there quietly. Although it had been air-dried for a while, its surface was still oily and bright. Emitting a unique fishy, bitter smell, the old man's hands froze. He suddenly raised his head and glanced at Zhou Chenglin. There was a trace of surprise in his eyes as he asked if it was a wild boar's gallbladder. So big? Zhou Chenglin was brief. He said it was from a 168 Jin boar king, killed just a few days ago. He assured him the skin was intact with no bile leakage, and told him to take a good look. The old man picked up the gallbladder and brought it to his nose to smell it. Then he held it up to the light and said the quality was good. It was a purple gold gallbladder, considered a top-grade item. The old man put down the gallbladder and flicked his fingers across the abacus a couple of times. He said this thing clears heat and detoxifies. It was a good item. But the market price was average right now. If he were to sell it to him, he'd give 15. Zhou Chenglin sneered inwardly. This old man must think he's young and dressed poorly. Trying to rip him off? This was the gallbladder of a boar king. In later years, a gallbladder like this could sell for thousands. Even though it was 1983 now, it was definitely worth more than 15 yuan. Zhou Chenglin reached out and wrapped the gallbladder back up. He made a move to leave, saying, Dr. Liu, that's not very fair of you. I know people at the rejuvenation hall down the street. I heard they're in need of this exact medicinal ingredient. This is a purple gold gall. For 15 yuan, you can keep it for yourself. Seeing that he knew what he was talking about, the old man quickly stopped him. He said, you name your price, and I'll make my offer. He asked him to name a price. Zhou Chenglin held up 5 fingers. He said, 50, not a penny less. The old man's eyes went wide. He said 50 was daylight robbery. Pork was only 70 or 80 cents a jin right now. This one gallbladder was worth more than an entire pig. Zhou Chenglin stared into the old man's eyes. He said, can you compare this to pork? This is life-saving medicine. He said if the old man resold it to the pharmaceutical factory in the city, or to those high-ranking leaders for their throats, he could sell it for at least 80. He was only asking for 50. That left him with a 30 yuan profit margin, which was more than fair. The old man had been found out. His expression changed as he re-evaluated the young man before him. He looked like a country bumpkin, but his calculations were crystal clear. The old man gritted his teeth and said, 45. Any more and I really won't. Take it, I have to make a little something for my troubles, too. Zhou Chenglin pretended to hesitate for a moment. He sighed and agreed, telling him to give him cash. With 45 yuan in hand, plus the wild boar hide in his basket. He sold it at the purchasing station for 12 yuan. Just from the leftover scraps he'd picked up on this trip. He had earned 57 yuan. If the people from his village knew about this, their eyes would pop out of their heads. But this wasn't even the big prize. Zhou Chenglin left the purchasing station and headed straight for the county's credit union. In those days, the counters at the credit union were intimidatingly high. You had to crane your neck to talk to the clerks inside. Zhou Chenglin found a corner. The money from selling pig gallbladders over the last few days, and what was left from selling bamboo worms and rats before. He pulled it all out, a big, messy pile. There were large bills, along with a heap of small notes and coins. He flattened and stacked the bills one by one according to their value, his movements slow and meticulous. Every bill carried his body heat, and the smell of dirt and sweat. The total was 3,280 yuan. The bulk of it was actually from the wild ginseng he sold to that mysterious Hong Kong businessman last time. He didn't keep all of that wild ginseng, he cut off a small half of the rootlets. He asked Fatty Zhang to find a way to try selling it, and it turned out that Hong Kong businessman was an expert. He was directly offered 72,800. The rest of the money was the more than 3,000 yuan he'd scraped together over the last half month, like an ant moving its home. In an era when having 10,000 yuan could get you in the newspaper, this was an absolute fortune. Zhou Chenglin took a deep breath and wrapped the money in newspaper. He walked to the counter, said he wanted to make a deposit, and handed over the newspaper bundle. Along with his crumpled ID card, the clerk inside was a middle-aged woman with permed hair who was busy knitting a sweater. Seeing Zhou Chenglin's attire, she didn't even bother to look up. She asked how much he was depositing, 10 yuan or 5. She told him to fill out a slip. Zhou Chenglin said, all of it, and pushed the newspaper bundle further in. The woman impatiently opened the newspaper. The next second, the knitting needle in her hand clattered onto the desk. That neat stack of large bills was as thick as 2 bricks. The cash seemed to shimmer alluringly under the light. The woman was startled. She quickly looked up at Zhou Chenglin and asked, where did you get so much money? Although she'd seen a lot, a peasant dressed like a beggar casually pulling out several thousand yuan was just too shocking. Zhou Chenglin said calmly, I saved it from selling mountain goods. And I sold some old family heirlooms. The woman gave him a suspicious look, but seeing that the money was real, she didn't ask any more questions. She got to work preparing his passbook, counting the money and stamping documents. She was busy for a full half hour. When that little red passbook was handed to Zhou Chenglin, his palm felt like it was burning. He opened it to the first page, where it was neatly written in pen. Balance. 3,280 yuan. Zhou Chenglin stared at that number for a full minute. In his past life, he nearly killed himself for a number like this. By the time he actually had money, his parents were already gone. He wanted to provide for them, but they were no longer there to receive it. In this life, this number was just the beginning. It represented that those few drafty thatched huts would become a thing of the past. It meant his mother would no longer have to secretly wipe away tears over medicine that cost a few cents. It meant Xiao Mei could wear new clothes to school. He carefully tucked the passbook into his innermost pocket, close to his body. He pressed it to make sure it was still there, then left the credit union. It was almost dark. Zhou Chenglin went to the co-op store and bought a pound of fruit candy. He also bought a few feet of floral fabric to make clothes for Shui Mei and a jar of vanishing cream for his mother's hands. Of course, he didn't forget to buy 2 big meat buns for the hero of the day, Da He. Watching Da He wolf down the meat buns in just a few bites, Zhou Chenglin patted his head. He said he'd head home after eating. Back there, he had a big performance to put on. By the time he returned to Green Rock Village, it was already dusk. The village was deathly quiet, with only a few occasional barks from the dogs. Zhou Chenglin didn't go straight home. Instead, he circled around to the base of his house's back wall. These few dilapidated thatched houses were passed down from his grandfather. The earthen walls had long since become brittle, and the few wooden pillars were completely riddled with insect holes. The house would sway whenever a strong wind blew, and when it rained hard, it would pour outside and drizzle inside. Zhou Chenglin stared at the back wall, which was already warped beyond recognition. A flicker of resolve flashed in his eyes. It was time for this house to fulfill its purpose. He wanted to build a new house, but in a village rampant with jealousy. If he suddenly built a new house out of nowhere, someone would surely report him, claiming his money came from a dishonest source. So, he had to find an excuse so convincing people would have to believe it, and maybe even feel sorry for him. The house collapsing. That was the perfect excuse. If the house collapsed and they had nowhere to live, it would be seen as a terrible disaster. Borrowing money to build a new house would seem like a last resort. Then, if he built a big, tile-roofed house, people would only say the kid had guts, daring to take on so much debt. They wouldn't be scrutinizing where his money came from. Zhou Chenglin glanced around, making sure no one was there. He found a thick wooden club. He faced the back wall, aiming for the corner that had long been softened by the rain. He jabbed it forcefully a few times. That spot was already a weak point, supporting the weight of half the wall. The earthen wall let out a pained groan. A few clumps of dirt fell off. Zhou Chenglin quickly jumped back. He gave a low command, telling Da He to bark. Da He understood instantly. The dog started barking furiously at the corner of the house. Zhou Chenglin took a deep breath. He braced himself and screamed at the top of his lungs, "This is bad. The house is collapsing. Mom, Xiao Mei, get out. Quick." In the quiet of the night, his shout carried a long way. Inside, Wang Gafeng and Xiao Mei had no idea what was happening, but when they heard Zhou Chenglin's cry, they instinctively ran outside. Just as they burst through the door of the main hall, there was a tremendous crash. That back wall, which had already been teetering on the brink, finally gave way under the strain and came crashing down. It took half the roof down with it. Tiles and rafters smashed all over the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust that filled the air. Wang Gafeng was so scared her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the ground, her face pale as a sheet. The house, our house. Zhou Chenglin, covered in dirt and grime, rushed out of the dust. He pulled his mother to her feet, his face a mask of terror and shock. "Mom, are you okay? Are you hurt?" Just then, the neighbors were startled by the commotion. Someone asked if it was an earthquake. Someone else said, "I think Zhou Chenglin's old wreck of a house collapsed." Everyone, let's go check. Make sure no one's trapped under there. Before long, the courtyard entrance was swarming with villagers holding torches and carrying lanterns. The old village secretary, with a coat draped over his shoulders, ran up so fast his shoes were nearly falling off. Is everyone alright? He asked. Zhou Chenglin was sitting on a millstone next to the pile of rubble. Holding Xiao Mei, who was still trembling, his face caked with dust. His eyes were red. He said everyone was okay. It's just, our home is gone, he said, pointing to the pile of rubble. His voice choked as he explained that he was out back feeding the dog. He saw a huge crack in the wall. The moment he yelled out, the wall collapsed. Luckily, he ran fast enough. Otherwise, his family of 3 would have been buried in there today. Looking at the complete mess, the villagers sighed. Some said it was too close a call. Others said the house should have been repaired long ago, that it was in disrepair. Plus, after being soaked by that heavy rain a few days ago, it's a miracle it even stood this long. Still others said that as long as everyone's safe, that's the greatest fortune. A house can be rebuilt if it collapses. Sun Shen was also in the crowd, looking at the Zhou family's tragic situation. Although he usually had a sharp tongue, this time, he surprisingly didn't make any sarcastic remarks, just pursed his lips. He said, well, this is great. Now it's a full-on outdoor camping trip. How will they get through the deep of winter? Zhao Erleng cowered in the back, staring at the pile of ruins. He actually felt a bit of pleasure at their misfortune, thinking it served him right for being so selfish. It was like even God couldn't stand it anymore and took his house away. The old party secretary looked at the tragic state of the mother and son and sighed. He told everyone to stop gawking and asked who had a spare room. Clear out a couple of rooms first, so the mother and son have a place to stay for the night. Just then, Zhou Chenglin stood up and dusted himself off. Although his eyes were filled with tears, they shone with a certain resolve. He said, there's no need to trouble you all. It's actually a good thing this house collapsed. Out with the old, in with the new. He took a deep breath. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed with weight. He said he planned to build a new house, not a mud brick one anymore. I'm going to build a brick and tile house, a big one. As soon as he said this, the entire crowd went silent for 3 seconds. Then, the ensuing chatter was even louder than when the house had collapsed. Someone asked, where is his family going to get the money for a brick house? Someone else said, a brick house costs a fortune. At least 2 or 3,000. Has he lost his mind? Zhao Erleng burst out laughing, mocking Zhou Chenglin, still dreaming of getting a wife, are we? With a couple of coins in his pocket, he can't even afford a single brick. A tile house? He should just build himself a pigsty. Faced with the crowd's ridicule and doubt, Zhou Chenglin didn't argue back. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a red passbook, still warm from his body. Of course, he didn't open it to show anyone the balance. He just held it tightly in his hand. He looked at the old party secretary and said he still had some money from selling wild boar meat. Plus the little nest egg my father left behind. If it's not enough, I'll borrow. I'll get a loan from the credit union. As long as I'm alive, I can pay back any debt. I am definitely building this house. Work starts tomorrow. I'll need the old party secretary to approve the permit. I want to expand the yard to the east, and build on that empty plot of land next to it. The old party secretary looked at Zhou Chenglin. At his shockingly bright eyes, there wasn't a single trace of cowardice in them, only the fierce determination of someone betting it all. The old party secretary slapped his thigh. He praised him, good lad. You've got guts. He said that as long as he had this kind of courage, I'll approve it to support him. Tomorrow, I'll send people to help him clear the ruins. Zhou Chenglin nodded and turned to look at the pile of ruins. Buried beneath those crumbling walls was the Zhou family's past, and after the sun rises tomorrow, a brand new, large house of red brick and tile would rise from these ruins. That would be his, Zhou Chenglin's first monument in this era. The sky was just beginning to lighten at dawn. The roosters in Qingxi village were still crowing at the top of their lungs, and a crowd had already gathered in front of the Zhou family's ruins. The loud crash from last night, coupled with Zhou Chenglin's declaration, I'm going to build a big tile-roofed house, was such a bold claim that it kept the entire village awake. So, early this morning, without any prompting, everyone brought their breakfast bowls, slurping on porridge, while running over to watch the spectacle. A man named Sun stood before the pile of rotten wood, muttering words of pity, but with a smirk on his face, clearly enjoying the show. He said that Zhou Chenglin didn't even have a place to stand now, and asked him if he froze sleeping outside all night. Zhou Chenglin was busy clearing the rubble. He was wearing a filthy padded jacket, his face covered in soot. He was bent over, dragging out a large, broken beam. Hearing Sun's words, he straightened up, wiped off some sweat, and grinned. He admitted he was freezing all night, but said it was no big deal. The cold won't kill you. In fact, it was just what I needed to clear my head. To realize this is no way for a person to live. Sun cautiously asked him, was all that talk last night about building a big house just a dream? Zhou Chenglin tossed the heavy beam to the ground. It landed with a thud that seemed to shake the very earth. He said that when Zhou Chenglin, says something, he means it. He told him to just watch. Today, he was going to completely transform this foundation. Just then, Zhao Erlang sauntered over, a toothpick dangling from his mouth. He asked sarcastically, and how are you going to transform it? Are you going to mold this pile of muck into bricks? Look, it's not that I'm looking down on you. But red bricks cost 4 cents a piece these days, and cement is ridiculously expensive. Even if you sold that dog of yours, you couldn't afford to build a single wall. The crowd around them roared with laughter. They all thought the shock had finally made Zhou Chenglin lose his mind. Zhou Chenglin ignored Zhao Erlang. He glanced up at the sun and said, let's see, by my calculations. They should be here by now. Zhao Erlang was confused. Who should be here? Just at that moment, from the main road at the village entrance, came a deafening roar. The sound was as loud as thunder, and the ground began to tremble. The gawking villagers jumped in fright. They all whipped their heads around to look toward the entrance, to the dirt road usually only traveled by ox carts. A huge cloud of yellow dust was rising, and then, a Dongfanghong walking tractor, with a big red flower tied to its front, spewing black smoke, came chugging in majestically. And behind that tractor, a second one followed, and then a third. A full 5 tractors lined up, forming a long dragon, like an army of steel. They surged into Qingxi village with great force. The villagers were all dumbfounded. In those days, a tractor was a rare sight. Normally, if even one came to the village, people would gather to stare at it for hours. To have 5 of them arrive at once, this was a truly grand spectacle. The tractor didn't stop, but instead drove straight on. It arrived at the empty lot in front of the ruins of the Zhou family's home, and the driver slammed on the brakes. The bed of the first tractor shot up, and a full load of bright red, sharp-edged bricks poured down like a waterfall, piling up into a small red mountain. Right after it were the second and third tractors, all full of red bricks. Brand new, perfectly fired red bricks. The fourth and fifth tractors tipped their beds, and dozens of gray cement bags printed with the words kindling cement, along with a heaping pile of river sand, were also unloaded. When the dust settled, in front of that pile of ruins, 3 mountains had instantly appeared. A mountain of red bricks, a mountain of sand, and a pile of cement. The entire place fell dead silent. The rice bowl in Sun's hand clattered to the ground, shattering into 2 pieces. The toothpick in Erlang's mouth fell out. His chin nearly hit the floor. The villagers who had just been mocking Zhou Chenglin all stood there with their mouths hanging open, their eyes practically popping out of their heads. How much must all this cost? Just 1 truck of bricks has to be several dozen yuan, right? 5 trucks, plus cement and sand. Did this Zhou Chenglin rob the credit union or something? Zhou Chenglin dusted off his hands and walked over to the lead tractor driver. Driver Xing was a big man with a fierce, fleshy face. He looked like someone you shouldn't mess with. He said, the goods are all here. 10,000 bricks, 20 bags of cement, and 5 cubic meters of sand. He told him to count it all, but Zhou Chenglin said, no need to count. I trust Brother Zhang. He pulled out a freshly opened pack of Dachiman cigarettes from his jacket. He gave 1 to each driver, then pulled several banknotes from his pocket. It was the shipping fee and final payment he had prepared earlier. In front of all the villagers, he slapped the money into the driver's hand. He said, thanks for your hard work, brothers. I'll have to trouble you to make a few more trips for the next batch. This is just the beginning. The drivers, holding the money, cheerfully drove their tractors away. It wasn't until the tractors were far in the distance that the villagers snapped out of their daze. A crowd instantly formed around Zhou Chenglin. Someone asked if he had bought all of it. Someone else exclaimed, so many red bricks. Is he really going to build a big, tile-roofed house? Another person asked him where he got so much money. Facing the crowd's questions, Zhou Chenglin already had his story prepared. He let out a sigh with a pained expression and pointed at the pile of bricks. He said that he had no other choice. The house collapsed. I can't let my old mother and my sister sleep on the streets, can I? He said he had gone into the city overnight yesterday to find his distant cousin uncle, who works as a contractor at a coal mine. I got on my knees and kowtowed to him. I threw away all my pride. I put everything on the line to borrow this sum of money. Someone asked, you borrowed it? Zhou Chenglin gritted his teeth. With a look of physical pain, he said, it's a high-interest loan. 3% interest. I borrowed this money with blood and tears. But even if I, Zhou Chenglin, have to work myself to death, even if I have to sell my own blood, I am going to get this house built. I can't let people make a joke out of me. When they heard it was a high-interest loan, and that he had to pay back interest, the people who had just been green with envy instantly felt a lot more at ease. Someone said, 3% interest. That's the kind of loan that rolls over and crushes you. And someone else said, this kid's got some nerve. Isn't he afraid he won't be able to pay it back and get thrown in jail? Although they said that, looking at that pile of red bricks, the envy in everyone's eyes was impossible to hide. Who cares if he borrowed the money? The man has the real deal. He's going to build a new house. Zhou Chenglin didn't give them much time to gossip. He jumped onto a large rock, cleared his throat, and shouted for everyone to quiet down. The crowd slowly quieted down. Zhou Chenglin looked around at everyone. He said that he had the materials, but he couldn't grow 3 heads and 6 arms. He couldn't build it all by himself. He needed to hire people. He wanted to hire the best masons and the strongest laborers in the village. When the villagers heard there was work, they immediately perked up. It was the slow season for farming, and everyone was bored out of their minds. Getting work points or money was an opportunity they couldn't have asked for. Zhou Chenglin waved his hand and said that this time, he wouldn't be giving work points. He'd be paying in cash, 2 yuan a day for skilled workers, 1.5 yuan a day for laborers, and there would be meat for every dinner. When he said they could eat their fill, the crowd exploded even more than when they first saw the red bricks. 2 yuan a day, and meat at every meal. That was better pay than the city workers got. Usually, when villagers helped each other out, at most you'd get a meal and a cigarette. Who would pay money? And so much money, too. The village's famous mason, a dark, thin man named Qian Leasi, swallowed hard. He asked, "Are you serious? Meat at every meal?" Zhou Chenglin pointed to the half-finished roof beam of his own house. He said that half-carcass of wild boar was still hanging from the beam. This afternoon, they would be feasting on that wild boar, pork stewed with vermicelli noodles, and big white steamed buns. Whoever worked the hardest would get to eat the most. Qian Leasi rolled up his sleeves. His voice boomed like thunder as he said, "I'll do it. I'll take this job. If anyone dares to slack off, I, Qian Leasi, will be the first one to give them a beating." In an instant, the area in front of the Zhou family's house turned into a hiring site. Dozens of strong men were pushing and shoving to get picked. Zhou Chenglin stood on the rock like a great general, picking his troops. He had Qian Leasi lead the masonry team and the strongest men mix the mortar. He had Genzi take a few people to fetch water. He picked all the men who were known to be honest and hardworking, and had decent character. As for those who were usually lazy shirkers and loved to gossip, he didn't pick a single one of them. Zhao Erleng was squeezed in the crowd, and seeing others get chosen, he was so anxious he was practically jumping up and down. He waved his arms frantically, shouting that he was there too, and that he was strong. 1.5 yuan a day, and you get to eat meat too. Where else could he find a deal that good? Zhou Chenglin glanced down at him, and sneered, "You should save that strength of yours for climbing over walls. This is hard work. I'm afraid it'll break that skinny little waist of yours." He paused deliberately, saying in front of everyone, "My Da He is over there watching you. If you come in, and he mistakes you for a thief and bites you, I won't be paying your medical bills." As if on cue, Da He, who had been squatting by the ruins, stood up. It bared its fangs at Zhao Erleng, its eyes as fierce as a wolf's. Zhao Erleng had been bitten by this dog yesterday, and he was traumatized. He was so scared he retreated 3 steps, nearly tripping over the threshold and falling flat on his face. He spat resentfully and said, "What's so great about him? Borrowing money to build a house. Sooner or later, it'll be the ruin of him." After cursing, he could only scurry away. His retreating figure looked utterly pathetic. Once the men were chosen, the work started immediately. When country folk work, as long as you reward them well, their efficiency is astonishing. Those clearing the rubble got to clearing the rubble, and those digging the foundation got to digging the foundation. Qian Leasi was on the empty plot with a measuring tape and lime, drawing lines. He asked Zhou Chenglin if the foundation he'd drawn was a bit too big. It was laid out for 5 main rooms, plus 2 side rooms. This courtyard was almost as big as the brigade headquarters. Zhou Chenglin, holding the blueprint, directed the whole operation. He said to build it just like that, and told him to dig the foundation deeper. They had to use plenty of stone. He was building something to last for 100 years. Something to be passed down to his grandson. Although Qian Leasi found the scale a bit intimidating, he was getting paid to do a job. He said, "All right, the boss calls the shots." While the men were working up a storm over there, the women weren't idle either. Wang Gafang, along with Xiao Mei and a few other helpers, were all specially hired and paid by Zhou Chenglin. They were busy at a makeshift outdoor stove where a large iron wok was set up. The fire was burning brightly. From Zhou Chenglin's half a wild boar carcass, he cut off a good 10 pounds, chopping it into palm-sized chunks. It was blanched in water, then thrown into the large wok to be stir-fried. He added green onions, ginger, garlic, star anise, and dried chilies, finally pouring in half a bucket of soy sauce. The rich aroma drifted for miles on the wind. When lunchtime arrived, a huge basin of pork stewed with glass noodles and a huge basin of white steamed buns were brought to the worksite. The pork was stewed until it was tender and glistening, and the glass noodles had soaked up all the broth. Joe Chenglin gave a shout, telling everyone to eat. The men, who had been working hard all morning, stared at the meat in the basin. Their eyes green with hunger. No one stood on ceremony. Each man ladled a heaping bowlful, squatted on the ground, and started digging in. It was a mouth-watering sight. Those villagers who hadn't been chosen for the job stood in the distance. Watching this scene and smelling that meaty aroma, they were drooling with craving, their guts twisted with regret. If they had known Joe Chenglin was actually this generous, they wouldn't have offended him in the past. Even if they had just tossed his dog a bone, they might have gotten a bowl of this meat today. Sun stood at his own doorway, holding a bowl of pickled vegetables and thin porridge. Watching the lively scene over at the Joes, he was so angry he threw down his chopsticks. He said, "What a sin. Borrowing money to show off like this. Just wait until the day his house is finished. That'll be the day he starts begging." Joe Chenglin, holding his bowl, squatted next to Qian Leasi, taking big bites of meat. He looked at the bustling construction site before him, watching the truckloads of red bricks become walls, and felt an indescribable sense of satisfaction. He asked Qian Leasi, "At this rate, how many days until we can top out the roof?" Qian Leasi wiped the grease from his mouth and said that as long as the materials and manpower were sufficient. Even though it was a bit cold, they had plenty of people. 10 days at most, and he could get him into his new house. Joe Chenglin agreed, "All right, 10 days it is." A glint of gold flashed in his eyes. When the new house was finished in 10 days' time, not only would he have a roof over his head, but he would also give the entire village an even bigger surprise. Because his X-ray vision had told him, right when they started digging the foundation. At 3 meters deep beneath the old wall's foundation, a strange metallic glint was shimmering. It wasn't gold, and it wasn't silver. It was a rusty Mauser pistol. Next to it was an iron box, wrapped tightly in oilcloth. What was it? Joe Chenglin didn't know, but he knew that once the foundation was dug down to that spot, he would have a new story to tell. But for now, it was time to build the house. Watching the red bricks being laid layer by layer, Joe Chenglin felt that this was the first stake he had planted for himself in this new era. A very sturdy one. When the foundation was halfway dug, a small incident occurred. Joe Chenglin purposely made an excuse, saying the soil in a certain corner looked a bit loose. He said he was worried it might settle later and insisted on jumping down to clear it himself. Qian Leasi and the others didn't think much of it. It was a good thing for the boss to be particular. After all, they were just there to do the work and get paid. While everyone else was on a water break, Joe Chenglin jumped into the pit, which was over 2 meters deep. He was quick and nimble. After a few digs with his hoe, the iron box tightly wrapped in oilcloth was exposed. The rusty Mauser pistol was right next to the box. It looked like something left behind by bandits or guerrilla fighters from the old days. Joe Chenglin didn't dare touch the gun. That thing was a hot potato. Bringing it out would be nothing but trouble. He used his hoe to push the gun deeper into the dirt, making sure it was buried even deeper. His target was the iron box. The box wasn't large, it was only about the size of a biscuit tin, but it was incredibly heavy. His X-ray vision had already seen what was inside, 10 small gold bars, all lined up neatly. In other words, gold bars. They weren't very big, each one weighing about an ounce, but this was the hardest of hard currencies. In this day and age, if these 10 gold bars were exchanged on the black market, they would fetch a huge sum of several thousand, maybe even tens of thousands. Joe Chenglin's heart pounded wildly, but he didn't let any of it show on his face. He quickly tucked the iron box inside his shirt. He had specially sewn a large hidden pocket in there, which was just the right size to hold it. Then he pretended to dig a few more times before climbing out, covered in dust and dirt. He shouted out that it was all good now, that the ground was solid. "Let's keep going and finish the foundation tonight." With this weighty confidence tucked away, Joe Chenglin felt like he was walking on air. Things were looking up. Now, even if someone investigated the source of his money in the future, if he was ever forced to explain, this box of gold bars would be his excuse. He could say his ancestors buried it. Who could argue with that? Over the next few days, the Joe family's construction site was a hive of activity. Bricks were brought in by the truckload. The walls grew higher by the day. Those men, getting paid in cash and eating well on pork. When it came to work, he really gave it his all. Originally, Qian Leasi had said it would take 10 days. But in just 5 days, the frames for the 5 main rooms were already up. This speed stunned the entire village. Whenever they had free time, everyone loved to gather at the Joe family's gate to watch. Seeing that house of red bricks and large tiles take shape bit by bit, the envy in their eyes was about to overflow. Some said Joe Chenglin had truly made a comeback. Others said borrowing money to build a house. You couldn't find a second person in the whole village with that kind of guts. And still others wondered how he would ever repay that debt. It was at a 3% interest rate. That was a killer loan. Just as everyone was worrying for Zhou Chenglin about repaying the debt, Zhou Chenglin did something else that made the entire village's jaws drop. That day at noon, taking advantage of the lunch break on the construction site, Zhou Chenglin went over with 2 bottles of Zaifeng wine and a carton of Dachingmen cigarettes. The old village secretary was hunched over his desk doing accounts. When he saw Zhou Chenglin coming, he quickly took off his reading glasses. The old secretary asked him why he had come at this hour. And how was the house coming along? As he looked at the 2 bottles of wine, his eyes lit up. Zaifeng wine was good stuff. Zhou Chenglin placed the wine and cigarettes on the table and didn't beat around the bush. He got straight to the point, saying the house was almost topped off. He said it was all thanks to the old secretary helping him arrange things. He had come to see him today about a serious matter. He wanted to ask him to approve something. The old secretary said that as long as it didn't violate any principles, he would get it done for him. Zhou Chenglin pointed to the area behind the village, to that vast, rocky slope, and said he wanted to lease that barren hill. The pipe in the old secretary's hand nearly fell. He asked him if he wanted to lease the barren, rocky hill. Was he crazy? The reason that place was called the barren, rocky hill was because it was full of nothing but rocks. The soil was so thin that even the grass couldn't grow evenly. Any crop you planted there would just die. Besides a few crooked trees and a hill full of scorpion holes, there was nothing. In the past, some villagers who didn't believe it tried to reclaim that land. In the end, after all their back-breaking work, they didn't even make back the money for the seeds. In the eyes of the people of Qingxi village, that was a piece of useless land. Zhou Chenglin had a serious look on his face. He said he had thought it through. Now that the house was being built, he was also saddled with debt. Just by farming, he'd never be able to pay off that high-interest loan in his lifetime. He figured that although the hill couldn't grow crops, it could grow fruit trees. He wanted to plant things like chestnuts and walnuts. Those were mountain goods. They could be sold for money in the future. The old secretary's brow furrowed so deeply you could kill a fly in the wrinkles. He said he wasn't trying to discourage him, but that place had more rocks than soil. After planting the saplings, it was questionable whether they would even survive. Besides, fruit trees take several years to bear fruit. What was he going to do about his high-interest loan? This was like jumping into a pit of fire. Zhou Chenglin put on a look of someone who had been pushed to the brink. He said he was taking a gamble now. If he lost the bet, at worst, he'd have to give the house to his creditors and go beg for a living. But if he won the bet, he could turn his life around. Besides, that piece of land was just sitting there barren anyway. If he leased it, he could even pay a little money to the village each year. Even if it was just a few dozen yuan, that would still be income for the collective. As soon as collective income was mentioned, the old secretary hesitated. That piece of land was indeed useless. It didn't produce a single penny. If it could really be leased out, even if we only collect 50 yuan a year, that's still free money. At the end of the year, we can even give some oil and salt to the lonely elderly in the village. The old party secretary stared at Zhou Chenglin and asked, "Have you really thought this through? This is no joke. Once the contract is signed, you can't back out of the lease fee." Zhou Chenglin pulled 5 large bills from his pocket, slapped them on the table and said, "This is the first year's lease fee." He paid the 50 yuan up front. Looking at that 50 yuan, the old party secretary sighed and said, "All right then. If this kid insists on hitting a wall, I won't stop him, but since this land is wasteland, we can't charge him too much for the lease. 50 yuan for a 50-year contract. But once this money is paid, it's non-refundable." Zhou Chenglin was secretly overjoyed. Spending 50 yuan to lease a gold mine for 50 years, how could this possibly be a loss? This was practically a robbery. Other people didn't know, but he had used his X-ray vision to see that there was an underground river beneath that rocky slope. The water temperature was constant, making it perfect for raising giant salamanders. Moreover, hidden in the cracks of the rocks all over the mountain were countless wild scorpions. Just these scorpions alone represented a massive fortune. The contract was signed quickly. Black ink on white paper, with a red thumbprint. With 3 presses, that several hundred-acre rocky hill would henceforth be named Zhou. Zhou Chenglin clutched the contract and left the brigade office, completely satisfied. This kind of news was impossible to keep under wraps. Before he even got home, the news that Zhou Chenglin took out a high-interest loan to build a house, and had now lost his mind. Leasing the rocky hill to plant fruit trees, had spread as if it had wings. Flying all over the village, under the big tree at the village entrance, Sun and Zhao Erlang's group were laughing so hard they couldn't stand up straight. Auntie Sun cracked melon seeds, a gloating expression on her face. She said, "When a poor man suddenly gets rich, disaster is sure to follow." Building that house wiped out his family's savings. Now he's leasing a barren mountain? Just you wait and see. In less than 3 years, he'll have to give up that big house to pay off his debts. Then he'll have to move back into that shabby thatched hut. Zhao Erlang was even more smug. He said, "Plant fruit trees? Not even weeds grow in that blasted place. If Zhou Chenglin can actually grow fruit there, I, Zhao or Go, will eat all the rocks on that mountain." The villagers were also chattering among themselves. Most of them shook their heads and sighed, feeling that although this kid Zhou Chenglin had a lot of drive, he was, after all, too young and biting off more than he could chew. He was bound to get in over his head. As Zhou Chenglin walked back, listening to all these snide remarks, he kept that simple and honest smile on his face. He didn't seem angry at all. He even ran into Sun, and took the initiative to greet him, saying that when the trees bore fruit, he'd invite him to eat some walnuts to boost his brainpower. This made Sun so angry he rolled his eyes. He said that soon, he'd be lucky to even get a hot mouthful of air to eat. Back home, Wang Gafeng, looking at the lease contract her son brought back, also wore a worried expression. "Can you really plant trees in that place?" She was heartbroken over that 50 yuan. Zhou Chenglin locked the contract in a cabinet and told his mother not to worry. He said, "We're not planting ordinary trees. We're planting money trees." Wang Gafeng was stunned and asked, "What's a money tree?" Zhou Chenglin gave a mysterious smile and didn't explain any further. He turned and went into the cellar, where the nest of bamboo rats had already given birth to a litter of pups. They were pink and plump, and in the large clay pots nearby were the several hundred scorpions he had secretly caught from Rocky Ridge over the past few days. These scorpions were large and highly venomous, making them a top-grade medicinal ingredient. Zhou Chenglin watched the dark creatures crawling around inside the pots. His eyes gleamed with gold. He figured once the house was roofed, this first batch of scorpions would be ready to sell. Then, all those people waiting to see him fail would have their jaws drop in shock. 10 days later, the Zhou family's large brick house finally had its topping out ceremony. For the big day, Zhou Chenglin made a special trip to town to buy firecrackers. The deafening sound of firecrackers echoed over Bluestone Village, a spacious and bright, 5-room house made of red brick. Faced south, looking exceptionally grand, its roof was covered with brand new red tiles that shimmered in the sunlight. The courtyard had also been doubled in size and was enclosed by a high, red brick wall. With a large iron gate installed, no one could ever peek through the cracks again. Qian IV stood on the roof, tossing out a handful of celebratory candy and shouting, "Good fortune on the new home." Although the villagers below were green with envy, they couldn't help but scramble for the candy to soak up some of the good luck. Zhou Chenglin stood in the courtyard, looking at the new house that had seemingly sprung up from the ground. The weight in his heart was finally lifted. With this home, his mother and Xiao Mei would never have to suffer from the cold again. And with this high-walled courtyard, the secrets he kept hidden in the cellar would be that much safer. Just as everyone was gathering around the new house to see the commotion, a black, old-model Santana sedan suddenly drove into the village, stopping in front of the Zhou family's brand new iron gate. The car door opened, and the first person to get out was Fatty Zhang from the state-run canteen. Right after, a middle-aged man in a trench coat and sunglasses stepped out from the backseat. He was carrying a black leather briefcase and had the distinct air of a big boss. The entire village fell silent. In those days, anyone who could arrive in a car was an absolutely huge deal. The boss in the sunglasses took them off, revealing a pair of shrewd eyes. He spoke in a thick, non-standard Mandarin accent, asking with a Hong Kong lilt if this was the home of Zhou Chenglin. Zhou Chenglin walked up to them, a knowing smile on his face, as if he'd been expecting them. He said he was Zhou Chenglin and asked Brother Zhang who his companion was. Fatty Zhang leaned in with a huge grin on his face, and whispered that his brother's fortune had finally arrived. "This is Boss Lin from Hong Kong. He's in the medicinal ingredients business. He's the one who bought that batch of ginseng roots I had you sell for me last time. This time, he came specifically for the stock you're holding onto." Although Fatty Zhang kept his voice low, a few villagers standing nearby still overheard him. They'd heard it clearly. A boss from Hong Kong had come looking for Zhou Chenglin to buy medicinal ingredients. Hiding in the crowd, Zhao Erleng stared at the shiny car. Then he looked over at Zhou Chenglin's calm expression, and a sudden sense of foreboding washed over him. Could it be that Zhou Chenglin wasn't just messing around? Just how many more secrets was this kid hiding? Zhou Chenglin paid no mind to the shocked onlookers. He simply made a gesture, inviting them in. He welcomed Fatty Zhang and Boss Lin through the large iron gate that hadn't even been painted yet. Then, with a loud clang, the heavy gate swung shut. It shut out the entire village's curiosity and their countless eyes, burning with jealousy. Locking them all outside, the heavy iron gate closed with another clang, shutting out the hundreds of prying eyes and whispering mouths from outside the gate. All of them were shut out. The newly laid red brick ground in the courtyard was still damp. A black Santana was parked right in the middle of the courtyard, looking completely out of place in this newly built farmhouse. Yet, it exuded an indescribable air of importance. The moment Fatty Zhang got out of the car, he gave a thumbs up, praising the courtyard for its impressive look. Good feng shui, facing south with its back to the north. It will attract wealth. That boss Lin with the sunglasses also took them off, revealing a pair of small, shrewd eyes. He scanned the surroundings, nodded, and in Mandarin with a thick Hong Kong accent, introduced himself, saying he was Lin Jiaming, and he was in the medicinal herb business. Zhou Chenglin wasn't intimidated. Although he was wearing that old cotton padded jacket, his back was ramrod straight. He wore a smile that was neither servile nor arrogant and said, "Let's not just stand here in the courtyard. Please, come inside. The house is a mess, please don't mind." They entered the main hall which had just been roofed. The inside hadn't been plastered yet, and there wasn't even any decent furniture. Just a square table that the workers had been using for meals, and a few long benches. Wang Gafeng and Xiao Mei had long since hidden in the inner room. They had never seen such a scene before, and didn't dare to come out. Zhou Chenglin brought out 2 thick ceramic bowls, poured 2 bowls of plain boiled water and said, "We don't have any good tea in the countryside. Plain water will quench your thirst." Boss Lin didn't show any disdain. He picked up the bowl and took a sip, but his gaze kept drifting towards Zhou Chenglin. He said, "Let's not beat around the bush. Those few ginseng rootlets that Manager Zhang gave me last time were of excellent quality. I made a special trip here this time, specifically to see the main article. As long as the item is right, the price is not an issue." He was a businessman. Time was precious. If it weren't for the fact that those few rootlets had been appraised and confirmed to be over 100-year-old wild ginseng, and a rare skinless variety at that, he wouldn't have come to suffer in this backwater place. Zhou Chenglin smiled, and without a word, he stood up and walked to the corner of the room. There sat an inconspicuous, worn-out basket, covered with a few tattered rags. He reached out, lifted the rags, and pulled out a rusty biscuit tin from inside. The metal box looked like something salvaged from a junk collector. It was still covered in a fair bit of dirt. Boss Lin's brow furrowed slightly. "Keeping such a valuable item in this shoddy box? Aren't you afraid it'll get damaged?" Zhou Chenglin placed the metal box on the table. His movements were very gentle. "The item is right here," he said, "for you to take a good look." He opened the lid. A faint, earthy medicinal fragrance instantly wafted out of the box. He lifted the top layer of fresh moss. There, a perfectly preserved, 100-year-old wild ginseng with its crown and long body intact, lay like a sleeping spirit, resting quietly on the green moss. Its skin was firm, its rings as dense as iron threads, and the pearl-like nodes on its crown were clearly visible. Boss Lin gasped and shot up from his seat. He pulled a magnifying glass from his pocket, his entire body practically leaning over the table. His face was almost touching the ginseng. As he examined it, model, he couldn't help but exclaim in admiration, saying the root head was flame-cured. The skin has a brocade pattern, and look at its form. It's brimming with vitality. It has to be at least 120 years old. An absolute top-grade specimen. Fatty Zhang was right beside them, and even though he's no expert, just seeing how excited Boss Lin was, he knew this was a sure thing. He nudged Zhou Chenglin with a look, as if to say, "Brother, you're about to strike it rich." But Zhou Chenglin remained perfectly calm. He sat leisurely on the stool, sipping his water, acting as if he were just watching someone else's deal. He knew the item was valuable, but more importantly, he knew that he held all the power in this negotiation. This was a one-of-a-kind item. Miss this opportunity, and there won't be another. He examined it for a full 10 minutes. Only then did Boss Lin reluctantly put away his magnifying glass and sit back down. He took a deep breath to compose himself. The way he looked at Zhou Chenglin changed. The condescending glance he'd give a young punk was gone. In its place was a newfound respect. Boss Lin held up one hand, spreading all 5 fingers, and said, 5,000 yuan. This price was enough to buy 2 houses in this county. Hearing this, Fatty Zhang's heart leapt into his throat. This was really getting rich overnight. An ordinary worker couldn't save 5,000 yuan in a lifetime. But Zhou Chenglin just smiled. He shook his head. He reached over and closed the lid of the iron box. "Boss Lin, you're the expert here," he said. "I'm just a layman, but even I know its general worth. You just said it yourself. This is a 120-year-old, top-grade specimen. 5,000 yuan? That's what you'd pay for a turnip." Boss Lin's expression stiffened. He said, "A man shouldn't be too greedy. 5,000 is already an astronomical price. This item may be good, but not many people here on the mainland can afford it. Who else are you going to sell it to, besides me?" Zhou Chenglin replied, "That's not necessarily true. I've asked around. Foreign trade companies in the city are buying these things up to export for foreign currency. And if all else fails, I'll just keep it for my grandson. This kind of thing only gets more valuable with time. Besides, I'm in no rush for the money." This tactic of feigning retreat was executed perfectly. Boss Lin gritted his teeth. He knew he'd met his match. This kid might look like a country bumpkin, but he knows the market inside and out. It's true, if this ginseng were taken back to Hong Kong for auction, or sold to one of the wealthy clans to save a life. It could fetch at least 50,000 Hong Kong dollars. In a low voice, Boss Lin told him to name his price. Zhou Chenglin held up 2 fingers. 20,000. Fatty Zhang, who was taking a sip of water, did a spit take and started coughing violently. 20,000? That's an outrageous demand. You could buy the whole village with that kind of money. Boss Lin laughed out of sheer disbelief. Now you're just joking. 20,000 could buy this entire village. Zhou Chenglin leaned forward, staring Boss Lin in the eyes. He said, that's not how you should be calculating it. This is a life-saving item. How much is a life worth? To those big bosses who needed to save their lives, 20,000 is just pocket change for a single meal. You take this back, you sell it, and you'll at least double your money. All I'm asking for is 20,000. That's not asking too much, right? Boss Lin fell silent. He was quickly calculating in his head. Indeed, the quality of this ginseng root was too good. It was a once-in-a-lifetime find. If he really missed out on it, and it was bought by another competitor, the loss would be more than just money. His reputation would be on the line, too. The boss was still trying to test him. He offered a flat 10,000, cash on the spot, to Zhou Chenglin. Zhou Chenglin said 18,000. Boss Lin said 12,000, and not a penny more. Zhou Chenglin tapped the table and said 15,000, telling him to stop haggling. Besides, if he had any other good items in the future, whether it was tiger bones or musk, he would save them all for him. This was a long-term deal. When he heard tiger bones and musk, Boss Lin's eyes lit up again. There were certainly a lot of treasures in these deep mountains. If he could develop this kid into a steady supplier. With that, the boss slapped his thigh and said, it's a deal. 15,000 it is, but he had one condition. He wanted to pay part of it with foreign exchange certificates. Foreign exchange certificates. Back then, they were even more solid than cash. A hard currency you could only use to buy imported goods at the friendship store. It was a symbol of status. Zhou Chenglin was ecstatic on the inside, but on his face, he feigned reluctance. He said, fine, the certificates are okay, but we have to use the black market exchange rate. Boss Lin burst out laughing and said the kid was a sharp one. From his black leather bag, he took out stacks of crisp, new bills. 10,000 yuan in large bills, forming 10 bundles. They were as thick as bricks. There was also 5,000 yuan worth of foreign exchange certificates. They were so colorful, they looked very exotic. Counting the cash, inspecting the goods, the entire exchange took less than 10 minutes. When that 15,000 yuan was actually tucked away in his clothes, Zhou Chenglin felt like his heart was going to jump out of his throat. 15,000, plus the over 3,000 in his passbook. His net worth was now close to 20,000. In an age when being a 10,000 yuan household was a rarity. He, Zhou Chenglin, had become a true, bona fide rich man. Boss Lin carefully placed the iron box with the ginseng into his leather bag. He stood up, shook Zhou Chenglin's hand, and said, it's been a pleasure. Here's my card. If you get anything good in the future, give me a call directly. Our contact manager Zhang. Zhou Chenglin smiled and tucked the business card away. He said, absolutely, absolutely. After seeing off Boss Lin and Fatty Zhang, the moment their Santana left the courtyard, it was surrounded by curious villagers. Even though the windows were rolled up and they couldn't see who was inside. Just seeing the black smoke coming from the back of the car made every one of them crane their necks. A buzz of discussion erupted. Someone asked, are they gone? Who was that? Someone said, I hear he's a big boss. Someone else asked Zhou Chenglin, what did you bring that boss into the house for? Did you sell something? Zhou Chenglin shut the large iron gate, ignoring the commotion outside. He quickly returned to the main hall and bolted the door shut. He then drew the curtains shut. Only then did Wang Gafeng and Xiao Mei dare to come out from the back room. Xiao Mei timidly asked if the men had left. Zhou Chenglin said they had. He took a deep breath, and from inside his shirt, he pulled out those bundles of money. And the stack of foreign exchange certificates, and piled them all onto the table. Xiao Mei let out a scream, then quickly covered her mouth. Wang Guifeng's legs gave out, and she collapsed right onto the floor. Staring at the table full of money, she was completely stunned. She asked if it was all theirs. Zhou Chenglin took his mother's hand. He pressed a thick wad of bills into her hand and said it was all theirs. This is what they got for that ginseng plant. From now on, they wouldn't have to borrow money to build a house. They wouldn't have to bow and scrape to anyone anymore. He could eat whatever he wanted, and wear whatever he wanted. This can't be a dream, can it? It would take lifetimes to spend this much money. This is just the beginning. In the future, their lives would be 100 times better. That night, no one in the Zhou family could get any sleep. Wang Guifeng slept clutching the money, checking every so often to make sure it was still there. Meanwhile, Zhou Chenglin lay on the Kong bed, listening to the sounds outside the window. He listened to the sound of the wind as his mind raced, planning his next move. Now that he had this money, he could buy the best saplings for the orchard. He could also buy a few breeding pigs. And he could finally get that fish pond dug. He could even think about heading to the provincial capital to look around and scout out some more profitable ventures. As the night wore on, the barking of the village dogs slowly died down. Outside the walls of the Zhou family's compound, a dark figure was moving stealthily along the foundation. It was Zhao Erleng. He had seen the car drive into the village earlier that day. He'd been itching with curiosity ever since. He had a gut feeling that kid Zhou Chenglin was up to something. A kid who was dirt poor was suddenly building a big house, and now some big shot had shown up. There had to be something fishy going on, and when that boss was leaving earlier, the leather briefcase he was carrying had been bulging. But when Zhou Chenglin saw him off, his hands were empty, but the look on his face was clearly off. A sinister look filled Zhao Erleng's eyes as jealousy surged through him. He looked up at the new, 2-meter-high compound wall. The wall was too high. It even had shards of glass embedded on top. There was no way he could climb it, but he wasn't about to give up. He circled around to the back of the compound. The foundation there wasn't completely filled in yet, and there was an opening for a sewer drain. He got down on the ground, pressing his ear to the opening of the drain. He wanted to eavesdrop on what was happening inside, even if he could only catch a word or two. Tomorrow he could go spread rumors all over the village, saying Zhou Chenglin was engaged in illegal profiteering. He would ruin that kid's reputation. But just as he pressed his ear to the opening, a big black dog lying in its doghouse in the yard suddenly lifted its head. Its eyes, glowing green in the darkness, were locked on the sewer drain in the back of the yard. Its ears twitched. It had heard the faint sound of breathing. Da Hei didn't bark. He rose to his feet without a sound. Like a ghost, he slunk along the base of the wall to the back of the yard. He lowered his head, staring at the drain's opening. His mouth opened slightly, revealing his glistening white fangs. Zhao Erleng was still lying there, listening, but he couldn't hear a thing. He was just about to shift his position when suddenly, a puff of hot air blew through the iron grate of the drain. Right in his face. It was immediately followed by an incredibly deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the depths of hell, exploding right next to his ear. Zhao Erleng was scared out of his wits. He recoiled violently, landing right on his butt in a thorny patch of weeds, making him yelp in pain. On the other side of the wall, Da Hei began to bark furiously, his voice filled with viciousness. It was a heart-pounding sound. Immediately after, from the courtyard, came Zhou Chenglin's footsteps in his sharp voice, asking who was there. Zhao Erleng didn't dare to stay. He scrambled and crawled as he fled out of the village. He ran so hard he lost a shoe, shouting that there was a ghost as he went. A warmth spread through his pants. He had actually peed himself in fear. In the courtyard, Zhou Chenglin came out with a coat draped over his shoulders, shining a flashlight toward the back wall. Da Hei was baring its teeth at the sewer opening. Zhou Chenglin walked over. Activating his X-ray vision, he saw a worn-out shoe left in the grass outside the wall. There was also a noticeable wet patch. In the distance, a flustered figure was stumbling towards the west end of the village. Zhou Chenglin narrowed his eyes. The cold glint in them was colder than a winter night's wind. It seemed the last lesson wasn't enough. Since he insists on courting death, then I'll grant him his wish. He patted Da Hei's head and took a piece of dried meat from his pocket to feed him. Good job, he said. If he comes again, just chase him away. That night, Zhao Erleng was scared out of his wits. He went home and had a high fever for 3 days, while Zhou Chenglin guarded that table full of money. On this cold night, he had completely finished his post-rebirth. First primitive accumulation of capital. Tomorrow is another day. His business empire had just begun to unfold.